Well, welcome everybody. Glad that so many of you could come to this event to honour the life and work of Margaret Atack. I think that all of us here today are here because we knew Margaret for a long time, either as students, colleagues, friends, research collaborators, or possibly any number of those over the course of Margaret's career and life. One thing I think we can all say, whatever our relationship to Margaret, is how admired, respected and loved she was by, I believe, all who knew her. The obituaries, Di and I wrote a number of obituaries at the time of Margaret's death, which appeared in different places, and at least one of which you probably read, gave the broad sweep of Margaret's life and her career, which I don't want to repeat here. This isn't a we're here to celebrate Margaret's work rather than grieve as at a funeral. So I don't want to repeat those words, but by way of introduction, simply mention two characteristics that, for me, were at the heart of Margaret's distinctive quality as an academic. When I first came to the French department at Leeds in 1986, I was the first new appointment since Margaret in 1979, so there hadn't been an appointment for 7 years. And we felt, at least, the young guard then, in what was a fairly old-fashioned department. Anyone who knew the French department at Leeds, I'm sure, would agree with that description of it. Embracing new critical theory to understand cultural works in a new way. But Margaret was never simply one to jump on the bandwagon of new theory for effect, or because it was fashionable at the time. She was always serious, deeply intelligent thinker who refused orthodoxy of all sorts. So, for example, her refusal to accept the commonly received idea that France had to wait for the mot de RHUL 2 decades after the war for a serious and myth-free understanding of the occupation gave rise to her groundbreaking work on the extensive but little studied post-war literature that she revealed grappled in very complex ways with those years and didn't fit neatly into the myths that were established after the war. And then, when many of us young Turks, me included, embraced the idea of the postmodern as a conceptual model for understanding development since the 1960s, Margaret was always far more sceptical, and in retrospect, I think right, as she often was, about epistemological breaks, and as always argued her case not on the basis of belief, but through evidence and serious jargon-free analysis, which I think typified Margaret's work throughout. And it's that independence of thought that I always admired in Margaret. Admired, but also in awe, slightly, largely, of her intellectual prowess, based on a remarkable breadth of reading. Anyone who knew Margaret's house, anyone who knew Margaret's office, would know the number of books, not there for display, but that she'd read all of them and had taken them all in. So her intellectual prowess was built on huge and broad reading. And because of this, I always looked up to her for guidance and for support. And Margaret was excellent at that. So the other characteristic that for me was fundamental to who Margaret was as an academic, was her ability to listen to others and support them. Hundreds of students, many colleagues were the beneficiaries of that support from Margaret. So, intellectual rigour and empathy are two of my abiding memories of Margaret. And even towards the end of her life, when cancer restricted her activities, her enthusiasm for people and ideas was undimmed. And I'm sure that today we will celebrate these and many other of Margaret's qualities. Thank you.
I'll just add a little bit from my point of view that I can't remember exactly when I met Margaret, but it was quite early on in our careers, because we already knew each other when we both became involved with the setting up of the still thriving feminist network, Women in French, in the mid to late 80s. That network born out of shared frustration at the time, the overwhelming male domination of the whole field. After that, we would meet at conferences quite regularly and at meetings, and then in '99 I got the post at Leeds, so from that time until Margaret's death we were actually close colleagues. Margaret's work always included a strong feminist element, and she brought to the study and teaching of Beauvoir's work and of French feminism and literature more broadly the same intellectual rigour and breadth of vision that characterised all of her work. In 2015, along with Alison Fell and Imogen Long, we conceived and organised the academic programme of the biennial Women in French conference, always held in Yorkshire and over the last couple of decades always held in Leeds. And we did that on the theme of the 50th anniversary of 1975, that seminal year for French feminism. And we co-wrote and edited and published 2 books based on the conference agenda. Collaborating on teaching and writing with Margaret was always fun as well as intellectually rewarding. And we travelled to conferences together too, most notably to one in Marseille and one in Baltimore, and always took in some tourism while we were there. We also often met for dinner and more recently for lunch in Leeds, and took the world apart, or at least our own worlds apart. And just one final point while I'm still on the feminist theme. In 2015, Margaret was one of Melvyn Bragg's guests, you may remember, on In Our Time, which was devoted to Simone de Beauvoir. And she was, of course, absolutely brilliant. And when she died, so 8 years later, the programme's producer, Simon Tillotson, wrote to me to say that he had seen that Margaret had died and how well he remembered the quality of her contribution. In fact, I quote Simon Tillotson, he said, "I ought to relay to you the joy she brought to our recording. It was a tour de force." I reread Margaret's 2018 Ego History for today. It charts her intellectual trajectory from her first deliberations about what to do her PhD on, right through to much more recent publications. And I was struck, as always, I have quite recently pronounced the phrase, but Margaret, on the other hand, is a proper intellectual. So I was struck, as always, by the serious, scrupulous thoroughness that she brought to all her intellectual endeavours. Because even then, not even yet a postgraduate, just thinking about perhaps becoming a postgraduate, she was inspired by her reading of one novel, Jean-Louis Curtis's Les Forêts de la Nuit, and she immediately ordered everything that Curtis had ever written and read the lot straight through that summer. That's typical of her continuing career. And it was that same conscientious curiosity that led her to always feel that she hadn't read enough, and she hadn't really put the finishing touches to whatever paper she was writing. So she'd be scribbling away on the plane or in the train or in her hotel bedroom right till the last possible moment never quite convinced that she'd done enough. So it produced that stress for Margaret, but it also produced some of the most original, deeply theorised, multi-dimensional pieces of writing, and produced the very productive impact of her work on the field of French studies and beyond, especially, as we're going to see today, on the understanding of the cultural impact of the occupation of France in World War II. So we have 6 papers, all by top experts in the subject today, and we're going to start off with the very first panel, which I'm going to chair, which is Mike Kelly and Hilary Foottit. If you'd like to come up, then I think that's our introduction for the day, and now we'll move into the programme. As you know, there's lunch, and we hope that as many of you as possible will also be able to stay for the wine reception at the end, so that there'll be time to all talk to each other, as Margaret would have enjoyed. Let me just introduce Mike Kelly, who many of you will know already. Mike Kelly, is the Emeritus Professor of French at the University of Southampton. He's very well known because he's been a really important figure in the promotion, development, and, as has become increasingly necessary, defence of languages in the UK. This has included being a board member and indeed secretary of the European Council of Languages, being a prime mover in getting the learning and teaching of and research into languages onto the public and parliamentary agenda, and writing and editing volumes such as the 2017 Languages After Brexit, How the UK Speaks to the World. In 2014, Mike was awarded the OBE for services to higher education and European cooperation. Those were the days. But Mike is also a very productive and influential researcher, working on the history of ideas and the role of intellectuals, and more recently on the relationship between languages and conflict. He was one of the founding team of the important journal French Cultural Studies, in which we may well publish a volume based on the proceedings today. And he remains on their editorial board. And with Hilary, Professor Foottit, he co-edits a book series with Palgrave Macmillan on languages at war. Mike's topic today is ambiguity in French culture of the 1940s.
Right. So, unity and ambiguity, in fact, in French culture of the 1940s. I've chosen a topic which I know Margaret did a lot of work on. I would very much have liked to have spoken about her professional achievements. I had a long-standing relationship and dialogue with her about various aspects of French and languages over time. When I first arrived in Southampton in 1986, Margaret was still very much a live memory because she'd been temporarily a lecturer in French at Southampton before me. I remember particularly a little bit later a very decisive contribution to a conference we organised on French in the 1990s, back in 1991, just before the end of the binary line. Margaret was then lecturing in Sunderland and gave a very convincing and I think quite decisive contribution to the discussion, which highlighted the need for French to make common cause with other modern languages, which at the time was something of a novelty in the community of French studies. But Margaret was nothing if not brave and clear-sighted. And so I was very pleased to be the external examiner on her appointment panel when she was appointed at Leeds. And I think Leeds did very well as a result of that. And that's one of my academic decisions that I'm particularly pleased with. Anyway, enough about...
Can I just check, can everybody hear okay? Yeah.
I can lean towards the microphone. Or I could probably...
I think it's okay.
So this is what I'm going to talk about, starting with Les Années Noires and moving on through various aspects of the cultural movements of the 1940s. I'd like to start with Margaret's contribution to French Cultural Studies, an introduction, which I co-edited with Jill Forbes, the late Jill. And Margaret contributed a section on the myths and controversies around Les Années Noires, the myths and controversies about the occupation more generally, in which she highlighted the fact that speech and silence haunts the telling of this past, and she delved into what she called the madness of self-destructive, incompatible identities, a reference to Modiano's Place de l'Étoile, which was part of her discussion of the period and the memory of it. Now, at that stage, Margaret had already published the very groundbreaking book on French literature of and the resistance, in which she studied the structures of narrative discourse in a very wide range of novels that were widely referred to but very rarely studied, certainly not by serious literary scholars. I think there was a general impression that the literature of the period was essentially ephemeral and didn't stand up to the kind of analysis that was subjected to proper literature. But in that book, The Literature and French Resistance, Margaret, in fact, divided the novels into two types, broadly corresponding to periods of the occupation and the liberation. The first category was the novels of unity, the argument being that during the resistance, writers were keen to emphasise the need for unity against a common enemy, and they rallied around the themes, as Margaret put it, of France, man and culture. And in the case of man, as she so acerbically said, in the case of man, read man. Man with a capital letter actually means man with a small m as well in this period. So the liberation, on the other hand, was characterised by novels of ambiguity, reflecting the social and moral confusion of the post-war period. And I think this distinction between unity and ambiguity is a very productive one. Not that Margaret saw a clear-cut and definitive division between the two categories. She also saw interlacings and interweavings between them. And it's that insight of the relationship between unity and ambiguity that I'd like really to dwell on. The sense that bringing people together incurs ambiguity because people come from different directions and have different interests and priorities. One of the most astute commentators on ambiguity in this period was, of course, Simone de Beauvoir, whose essay Pour une morale de l'ambiguïté I think was a very programmatic and rather neglected aspect of her contribution. Talking about this, Beauvoir says, and I have the quote there, en un sens, l'attitude négative est facile. L'objet refusé est donné sans équivoque. Ainsi, tous les Français antifascistes étaient unis dans leur occupation par leur commune résistance contre un seul oppresseur. So that's the unity. Le retour au positif rencontre bien plus d'accueil, comme on a bien vu en France, où ont ressuscité en même temps que les partis, les divisions et les haines. So, confirming the notion of the confusion and the dissensions of the post-war period. And I think that whether Margaret had read that and took inspiration from it, I don't know, but it certainly confirms the kind of analysis that Margaret was making. However, ambiguity is not just a characteristic of the post-war period. For Beauvoir, it's part of the human condition. C'est parce que la condition de l'homme est ambiguë qu'à travers l'échec et le scandale, il cherche à sauver son existence. So, it's la condition de l'homme est ambiguë, whether it's during the resistance or during the post-war period. For Beauvoir, ambiguity, the primary focus of ambiguity is in the individual, in the psychology of the individual, between the être en soi and the être pour soi being consciousness. And I won't delve much deeper into that. But to say that certainly as her work developed, Beauvoir increasingly came to see that the individual ambiguities were also located in the broader situation, the social and material context, which is very much illustrated by her analysis in the Deuxième Sexe, among many of her works. So, ambiguity is both individual and social. And I would add the point that Sartre went on to make, that ambiguity is a fundamental aspect of the relationship between individuals and groups, and between groups. This is an analysis he develops in the Critique de la raison dialectique from 1960, where the relationship between mediation and totalization means that there is constant conflict, or at least tension, between groups attempting to come together in conflict over the kinds of totalization, i.e. the kinds of overall analysis, the kinds of perspectives that they share. So, unity and ambiguity are two sides of a single coin. And I want to use this insight to look at some of the cultural movements of the 1940s. Now, in my abstract, I promised to look at the ambiguities in a number of movements, including the existentialists, like Sartre and Beauvoir, and the socialists and independent left, like Vercors and his enterprise Édition de Minuit, to which I'd add the communists and fellow travellers, like Louis Aragon, Henri Lefebvre, and the Catholic personists and Christian Democrats, ranging from Mounier to Maritain and Catherine Marcel. Now, having only half an hour, it immediately became obvious to me that this was far too much to take on. So, developing the theme of bringing different groups and interests together at the risk of eliding differences or provoking quarrels, I want, in fact, to focus on the Catholic personalists, which is where I came into academic life, because they were the subject of my PhD thesis. And it was nice to revisit them for this purpose, and I think they fit quite well with the analysis. So I want to talk about, in particular, the review Esprit, which is still going strong, and its director, Emmanuel Mounier. It's a literary and philosophical review that was founded in 1932 with Emmanuel Mounier as its director from 1932 until his death in 1950. It was a journal of left-leaning Christians, as it eventually emerged from its initial ambiguities. And it proclaimed the need for une révolution personnaliste et communautaire, developing the value of the human person and the importance of human communities, taking a stand against the established disorder, the désordre établi, as Mounier labelled it. And as distinct from someone like Denis de Rougemont and his tragic pessimism, Mounier put forward the slogan of optimisme tragique, the idea that we must hope to be able to change things for the better, but be prepared for the heartache and the natural shocks of tragedy which will come with it. The characteristics of Esprit, just briefly, which make it really quite distinctive as a literary and philosophical review, was that it had a very strong social implantation among professional and intellectual Catholics in particular, which was its core readership. And it had strong provincial support through France. It was based in Paris, but it wasn't just a Parisian phenomenon. It had a very strong base, including an organised group of amis d'esprit, friends of the journal, throughout France, but also in Switzerland, Belgium, French-speaking, of course, and French-speaking North Africa, and indeed a little bit in French-speaking Sub-Saharan Africa too. The main struggle in the early days was to avoid being censored by the Pope and put on the index of forbidden works. And that remained a fairly constant struggle as the Catholic Church had condemned socialism or anything like it, and even gave a very difficult life to the early Christian Democrats. It was managed with help from some influential friends like Jacques Maritain, for example, and more radically minded priests who could do things even if they couldn't speak out. There were distinguished people leading some of these groups. Maurice Merleau-Ponty was an early leader of this group, as were people like Pierre-Henri Simon, Max-Paul Fouchard, and Maurice de Gondiac, the leading philosopher. As Esprit developed into the mid-1930s, it ultimately supported the Front Populaire, thus really having to take a political stand really for the first time, and came out as one of the few voices opposing the Munich Agreement, in a very hard-hitting editorial Mounier wrote called Lendemain d'une trahison. I won't go into the details of the 1930s. As we get into the 40s, Esprit was published in France during the drôle de guerre. The Mounier himself was mobilized in the auxiliary forces and was down in the south in Grenoble, where he was from. After the fall of France, Mounier stayed in the south, in the Grenoble area, and relocated Esprit to the unoccupied zone, where the review was allowed to appear in November 1940. Despite its leftish credentials, its Catholic credentials were a distinct help to enabling it to reappear. And initially, there was a detailed struggle with censorship because Vichy kept a very close hand on what appeared in print. And Mounier developed techniques of what eventually became known as contraband writing, sending messages which are clear to the initiated but seem inoffensive to those who are not. And of course, there was the usual debate about whether this was actually a clever thing to do or whether the Vichy government were being one step ahead and even more clever in letting this stuff through. The struggles with censorship carried on, became more difficult as the influence of Action Française and the extreme right in French politics became increasingly dominant in Vichy, and eventually Esprit was banned from publication in the summer of 1941. So that was the end of the review, and I'd just like briefly to mention, I can see time running away with me, so it will be brief. After the banning of Esprit, Mounier did continue his activities. During the period of Esprit's publication, he had been involved in a number of Vichy-related initiatives, which had the effect of enabling him to make contact with a whole generation of the Catholic elites through France. And I won't go to the detail of that, but his activity in these groups like Jeune France, which was a huge cultural movement, the École des Cadres du Riage, which was the precursor of the ENA, and the Compagnon Boy Scouts movement, and various other things. He was forbidden to participate in any of those. And after that, he went a little bit underground, and with the support of Henri Frenet in the combat movement, resistance movement, he founded a study group which eventually produced a Déclaration des droits de la personne, a kind of an update of the Declaration of Human Rights in the Constitution. He was eventually arrested in January 1942 and was held in prison, various prisons. He staged a hunger strike which attracted a lot of publicity because he was initially arrested without any charge and held in detention without being brought to trial. When he was tried in October, along with 50 other people who were accused of being members of combat, he was eventually acquitted for lack of evidence. I think he'd covered his tracks sufficiently well, and went into deeper hiding in the south of France, in Jeune-Fille, in the Drôme, near the Vercors, where he was accompanied by a lot of other well-known names, poets and writers and political thinkers who he'd associated with. He did help hold a couple of conferences of Esprit collaborators. And he did participate in an initiative called the Comité Général des Études, which was founded by, or set up by Jean Moulin to try and develop a more theoretical approach to a potential provisional government. However, this activity during the 1940s is fundamentally a combination of ambiguity and unity. Mounier wasn't one of these people who said, I will never publish anything as long as the Vichy government or the German occupiers are in power. He did try to affect public opinion, political initiatives, and for that, subsequent commentators have at times suggested that he may well have sailed a little bit too close to Vichy, and that he may have had sympathies which were a little more Platonist than subsequently appeared. Now, I think much of that criticism is actually generated by the experience of François Mitterrand, who was as adept as any at the double jeu, and whose ambiguities were much more profound than I think Mounier's were. But after the war, Esprit reappeared in December 1944, one of the first literary reviews to appear, not least because Mounier now had very influential friends in the provisional government, people who had served their time in the resistance and who were in a position to do things like release stocks of paper and printing ink. So a new generation of contributors also joined Esprit, which was again a result of Mounier's public activity during the Vichy regime, however ambiguous that might subsequently appear. Politically, he was much more engaged. The review gave a platform to many of the left-leaning organisations of the immediate post-war period, and he supported the Front National, the resistance-based attempt to create a united front of the movements coming out of the resistance. That, as we know, was not successful, and Mounier then did his best to try and support the tripartisme, communists, socialists and Christian Democrats, in the early administrations of the post-war period. And again, unity and ambiguity are everywhere on view. Attempting to unify the communists, socialists and Christian Democrats was a struggle, and only achieved at the expense of very significant compromises and ambiguities, which eventually led to the whole thing falling over, as we know. I'll skip over the moment of humanism, apart from saying that if even Jean-Paul Sartre could declare himself a humanist in 1946, then that reflected a kind of consensus of the post-war period, but also concealed huge ambiguities, which then led to a great deal of falling out. Mounier's use of the review was very much aligned with trying to keep the alliance together of the broadly progressive left, while still enabling and maintaining the distinctive differences that each of the currents held. And in particular, he was very severe with his own Christian Catholic strand of that alliance, accusing Christianity of a great deal of cowardice and lack of courage and hope in the face of difficulty. So the ambiguities that he may have incurred during the war for his relationship with Vichy was repaid in the immediate post-war period with the support that he gained from many people he contacted as a result of that public activity. And he used that to try and bring some sense of unity to post-war France. And I conclude my concluding slide by suggesting that ambiguity is the price of unity, as exemplified by the experience of Esprit and Emmanuel Mounier. The struggle for the soul of Vichy paid off. The efforts to unify the resistance similarly were important for establishing a post-war position and contributed to the very difficult struggle for national unity, which I think Mounier contributed to, even though the leadership of it was in the hands of others. However, of course, all the success in the period 1944 to 47 came to a shuddering halt with the onset of the Cold War and the collapse of the alliances which had been formed in the resistance and in the immediate post-war provisional government. And I think that's a lesson that unity is always provisional, because the ambiguities never go away, the differences remain, even though the unity of action may be feasible. And I'll stop there.
We'll move on to Hilary's paper, and then there may be time for a question or two at the end if anybody feels that they have one. So if I can just introduce Professor Hilary Foottit. Hilary is Associate Fellow here at the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies, which is part of the School of Advanced Studies. Before that, though, on over a long and distinguished academic career, immediately before, I think you were research professor at the University of Reading. And Hilary's work is well known, highly esteemed in the fields of women in politics, including in the European Parliament, and also particularly in terms of research into the Second World War and the liberation of France. But Hilary's also worked on the development of language policy that's included, for example, writing the governmental report on higher education and the National Languages Strategy in 2005. It's a while ago, but you know, you've been very much involved in that part of work as well. But the current field of research is highly topical in the sense that you're working on languages in zones of war and conflict. And I noticed, for example, Hilary's done a study of Afghan interpreters through Western eyes. And for this, you've won major AHRC grants, and I already mentioned the series that you're co-editing with Mike. And today, the topic, Hilary's topic, is Storying the Archive of War.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay, can you? It's a great honour to be presenting something at a symposium for Margaret. Someone once described her to me as the brain surgeon of French studies. I think she sets the bar very, very high. My paper takes as its focus Margaret's early doctoral research, the seminal Literature and the French Resistance, Cultural Politics and Narrative Forms, published by MUP in 1989, and situates that book within the contemporary context of 70s, 80s resistance historical scholarship within which she was working. I'm really interested in this paper in archives. Firstly, in how archives get to be formed, particularly in the 1950s, when there's no official collection of documents on the resistance. Secondly, how we create our own oppositional archives in relation to the contemporary historiography, which is what Margaret did. And finally, if I have time, what the implication of the digitization of archives today might be for us as researchers. To prepare for this symposium, I recently reread Margaret's 1981 book, and I was struck anew by how articulately courageous it is. I think it's easy to forget that she was pursuing the doctoral research on which this book is based within a very particular context of resistance historical scholarship, one which formed, if you like, and I lived this myself as a novice historian of the war, the accepted standard, the norm for understanding and interpreting the French resistance at that time. I want to examine the conception, methodology, and gendered ownership of this 60s, 70s, 80s resistance historiography in order to explore the ways in which Margaret's book was such a trenchant and influential rebuttal of the notions of history and historical truth, the accepted norm which resistance scholarship at that time embedded. So what were the origins and conception of this historiography? In the immediate post-war period up to the 1980s, French resistance scholarship was largely led by the Comité d'Histoire de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, the predecessor, 51 to 79, of the Institut d'Histoire du Temps présent. This research hub, the Comité, founded in the immediate aftermath of the war, was as an institution unique in many ways. It was created by the French government itself and originally included representatives of 11 ministries. The task of the Comité was twofold. Firstly, to establish the facts on the resistance, and secondly, to allow the generation of the resistors themselves, to have a voice, to give their own unmediated version of what had happened. It is, I think, difficult to overestimate the influence which the Comité had on French resistance scholarship. Laurent Bousseau noted in 29 that, I quote him, as late as the 1980s and 90s, nobody studied the French resistance without using these sources. Given that in the early 1950s, when the Comité was set up, the resistance was very recent history, without any established archives, the method the Comité chose was to create its own archive, to go out and about and collect as much information on the resistance as possible to form a new archive, documents, interviews, clandestine papers, tracts. The Comité pursued this search initially through a network of departmental correspondents who were themselves helped by departmental committees usually formed of ex-resistors. The ambition was to discover the facts by recording every bit of resistance activity in France. The Paris office of the Comité d'Histoire in the 8th arrondissement became a vast depository of this growing archive. I remember my own visits in the late 70s. In the middle of the room, there was a huge card file index of resistance actions and personalities. On the walls were beautifully coloured maps of each department, pinpointing what resistance had occurred in every locality. There were cupboards full of Romeo, you perhaps remember the smell of Romeo transcripts of interviews with resistors, over 2,000 across France. There were copies of resistance press and tracts. The whole vast collection was organised by resistance movement or réseau and classed alphabetically and by department. In addition to establishing the archive, collecting all this material, the Comité set up thematic commissions to research particular subjects such as internees and the deported, usually led by former resistors. So Daniel Mayer, the socialist resistor, was very influential. Members of the resistance donated their papers to the Comité, sometimes personal papers from major resistance actors, so Rolles Tanguy, the communist FTP leader, and Manuel Destier de la Vigerie, leader of Libération Sud. There were also papers relating to particular groups, Réseau du Souvenir, or the collection of Les Amicales des Réseaux Renseignements et Évasion. As an academic output from this burgeoning collection, this new archive, the Comité created its own journal, the Revue d'Histoire de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, which in the 60s and 70s was the go-to site for resistance research. Whilst the Revue carried articles on resistance outside France, and indeed the emphasis in early volumes was, I think, on aspects of military and international history. Its chief value to researchers like me was its special issues on France and its regular roundup of books published on the French resistance. The founding editorial team demonstrated the Comité's continuing balancing act between the presence of well-known resistors, so Georges Bidoux, president of the CNR, and senior fonctionnaires at the National Archives who would be known to the present government. As time went on, more former resistors were added, as well as well-known historians, Brodel, Souby, and political figures like Léopold Senghor. Besides the review, the Comité also sponsored an edition of books, L'Esprit de la Résistance, published by PUF, on particular resistance groups, Combat, Les idées politiques et sociales de la résistance, texts illustrating les courants pensées de la résistance. 17 books were published between 1954 and 1968 at a rate of more or less 1 or 2 per year. A subsequent collection on the liberation brought out by Hachette covered the liberation of each region in France, Auvergne, Bordeaux, Marseille, Lyon, with 15 titles published between 1973 and 1975. On the whole, all these volumes could be described, I think, as descriptive and chronological, rather than problematizing or interrogating the resistance. But before 1975, the archive of the Comité had spawned an academic review and 2 book series of 32 volumes. Meanwhile, Margaret, working away at her PhD on fiction and the war from 1940 to 1950, remembered in her Ego Histoire that, despite the quite considerable intellectual weaponry at her disposal, she had by then established a corpus of texts over a defined historical period and clearly had an understanding of the historicity of the relationship between literature and epistemology. I quote her, "I floundered for years. I had no idea how to shape a study of resistance fiction that would do something other than read through the words to identify themes reflecting their times." Contemporary analyses of the literature of resistance, she knew, prioritized historical rather than literary considerations. What was indeed important in the dominant historiography of the Comité was the view that resistance equated to military action, an activity which would be demonstrated through historical facts, through proof of activity. The resistance by this measure was like a sea of movements, groups and vaisseaux which had all done something in the war. For an outside researcher like me, it was like a soup of abbreviations, FTP, CNR, FFI, OCN. Indeed, the director of the Comité helpfully supplied a 10-page list of organisations as a crib, with explanations as to what the abbreviations of all the different groups stood for. The resistance was what was done, if you like, rather than what was written or said. A hugely complex node of busy, overlapping activity. In the mid-70s, whilst Margaret was collecting the corpus of fiction, which would be her research archive, there were indeed ongoing evaluations by historians as to what, if anything, had been the actual impact of resistance actions on events, on the real course of the war. The subversive Alan Milward, for example, argued in 1976 that the economic and strategic effectiveness of resistance was in fact negligible. I quote him, "As an individual act, resistance was liberating, satisfying and necessary. On a coordinated level, it seems to have been seldom effective, sometimes stultifying, frequently dangerous, and almost always too costly." M.R.D. Foote, the official historian, and incidentally participant in SOE, the Special Operations Executive, outlined the task, again in 1976, that he said resistance had addressed: intelligence, escape, and subversion. In comparison with these activities, he gave relatively short shrift to writing. I quote Foote, "Those who worked in the clandestine press and survived have made sure that we hear plenty of it. There were great names among them, and what they did was worth doing, as dangerous, as complicated, and as secret as any other resistance work, and some of it quite influential." What I find impressive about Margaret, as then a still young scholar, is her refusal to accept the terms in which the whole debate was then being conducted. I quote her, "To assess the contribution of the resistance to the war effort in primarily military terms entails a fundamental misrecognition of the value to be accorded to the ideological and the discursive at this time. It is difficult to see how, without public expression, there could have been a resistance." Margaret's challenge to this then dominant framing of resistance lies at the heart of her work, a rejection of the view that fiction of the war was largely valid in relation to what it might tell us about real events, a kind of mirror of the resistance, to be judged as accurate or inaccurate by outside historical experts. Importantly, the committee's historiography also established the status of these experts, those who were empowered to speak about the resistance. The axiomatic view at that time was that only those who had actually participated in the resistance were really qualified to write about it. The resistance was a clandestine and elusive adventure, intimately known only by its members. Hence, for some 30 years, historians of the resistance tended to be ex-resistants. Thus, the doyen of the Comité, Henri Michel, in Agrégé d'Histoire, had been active in the student resistance in Lyon. Thus, great resistance figures were involved in the Comité: Clausson, Cochet, Daniel Meyer, Marie Granet, François Bédériga. This resistance status was one which made it an enormously sensitive issue to criticise or interrogate the workings of the Comité. There was something sacrosanct and untouchable here. I remember in the late 70s having an opportunity to interview some resistors in the Comité and being overawed, not only by the quite obvious courage they displayed in the war, these were heroes, but also by the impossibility, the unthinkability really, of questioning them in any way. You let them talk, narrate, and you listened and took notes, and if you were lucky, recorded. Margaret's careful analysis of novels of the resistance was totally uninterested in this resistance status and the role which a writer might or might not have played in the war. Taking a wide spectrum, as Mike said, she looked to what she called novels of unity, Aragon, Beauvoir, Chanson, Morgan, Triolet, Vaillant, Vercors, and novels of ambiguity, Camus, de Relarchère, Nimier. All of these, published between 40 and 50, took the war, of course, as essential to the generation and resolution of the major conflicts in the books. However, she refused to analyse them in terms of the personal experience of the author and the relationship with so-called historical truth. She rejected, I quote her, the ultimate dominance of the historical in the evaluation of the place and value of this writing. Well, what of the methodology of the Comité? Methodologically, what was important in the history of the Comité was the collection of written documents. Documents as proof both of what was said to have happened and of the veracity of the resistance actor as historian. I remember this obsession with certain documents as sole proof of the validity of what you could say about the resistance in the late 80s, when I was co-writing a book on the liberation of France. The series editor, a distinguished French historian, explained to us that our book would not be judged academically respectable in resistance circles unless it contained at least 8 footnote references to documents on every single page. The result is doubtless worthy, but mostly, I fear, a truly reprobative read. In addition to the document obsession, there remained a considerable suspicion fostered by the Comité of any oral history which was not mainly directed at discovering facts about the resistance. Thus, Henri Michel from the Comité tried to discourage Roderick Hedward from his more anthropological oral history project in the Cévennes and with the Maquis, citing the primacy of the written over the oral in retrospective accounts. Margaret's methodology was very different. She explored the texts in themselves, not as documents of evidence, but as modes of narrative discourse, in which the social and political realities of the occupation were both apprehended and at the same time constituted in fiction during and immediately after the war. As she concluded, I quote her, "What emerges from studying the novels of the occupation and post-liberation years is the fact that none of this fiction can be seen as unproblematically fatal to the event. These novels are important elements in the complex battle for the meaning of these years." In doing this, I may say she struck a blow for many of her contemporaries, including me, who were feeling a growing unease, a dissatisfaction, if you like, with a historiography which totally discounted writing, words, in favour of action. Words, she averred, were an integral part of resistance activity. Words were vital in her archive of war. I quote her, "To read the fiction, or indeed the tracts and newspapers, as documents reacting to or reflecting the events, is to pose the question in false terms and really to miss the point. These words are not reflecting the struggle, they are deliberately and overtly part of it." How different that is from the Comité's approach at that time. What about the gendered ownership of this historiography? I think another way in which Margaret challenged the contemporary historiographical orthodoxy, perhaps unaware that she was actually doing this, was in her gender. The Comité's definition of resistance as combatant as quasi-military action almost inevitably meant that women were barely present in the historical writing produced by them, either as actors or subjects. As actors, the majority of the famous resistors were men, and the women who appeared within confines of this historiography were by definition exceptional: Lucie Aubin, Betsy Outland. To read the output of the journal Revue d'Histoire and those of the published Esprit and Libération book series is to be in a largely woman-free zone. As subjects too, before Paula Schwartz's seminal article on redefining resistance in 1987, women were hardly visible. As I recall the committee's massive card file, although I accept that I might have misremembered it over the years, women figured only as a subset of categories of the population: agriculteurs, ouvriers, fonctionnaires, and women. One might argue that in undertaking research and ploughing her own furrows so determinedly in this way, Margaret de facto called into question the gendered ownership of resistance historiography at that time, as well as its conception and methodology. In many ways, the archive she had established in opposition to that of the Comité and her approach to it in the 1989 book helped to precipitate a new cultural approach to war in France, one no longer located in historical studies. In a 2011 volume on French studies in and for the 21st century, the book resulting from Margaret's research, so Literature and the French Resistance, is described as a milestone in the development of war and culture studies in the UK. It made it possible to envisage studies of war by scholars who are not primarily historians, to examine the cultural and social implications of war, and in so doing, to engage productively with the key insights of French philosophers and cultural commentators. The Group for War and Culture Studies, established at the University of Westminster in 1995, we're going to hear from Debra, the leader, a little later, was emblematic of this influence. Importantly, the group was formed within a French department, where French and Francophone literary, linguistic, and cultural studies were the intellectual seedbed, rather than within a history department. With its interdisciplinary approach and its emphasis on the importance of representation, memory, and identity, the group would help to open out a field which in war studies was both new and revolutionary, but was in itself, I think, then ripe for development. So I think, I don't remember this well, Debra will be able to correct me, I think the initial response to the group was about 200 scholars from 14 countries who contacted Debra to say they were very interested in this sort of group. The conferences, seminars, and publications of the group were evidence of a cultural turn in war in France, which was extended in the foundation of a new journal, Journal of War and Culture Studies. It was unsurprising that Margaret was a contributor to the first issue of the journal, with her excellently titled article on sins, crimes, guilty passions in France's stories of war and occupation, followed later by her study of 3 French films. The latest issue of the Journal of War and Culture Studies demonstrates both how wide its range of interest has become in geographical terms. There's articles on the Iran-Iraq War, on Northern Ireland, on American intervention in Afghanistan, but also how closely it continues to mirror the parameters which Margaret pioneered. It is, I quote, a forum for the analysis, discussion, and dissemination of original research, exploring the relationships between war and culture in the modern and contemporary era. But of course, influence and milestones are as much personal as collective. If Margaret felt she floundered as a doctoral student before she found her way, I certainly, as a historian of war obsessed with language, floundered for a very great deal longer, dissatisfied with the historiographical orthodoxy on the resistance, but unable to see where I should be going myself. In a very real sense, I think Margaret's book demonstrated to me that it was possible to form other archives of war, one which examined and listened to words rather than reviewing actions. When I finally wrote Living with the Liberators, I felt at last able to argue that my archive of the words of participants, as they met in the maelstrom of war and liberation, were valid contributions to our understanding of experiences of war. Margaret, after all, had been out there before, challenging orthodoxies and creating her own archive. Like many of us here today, I expect, I personally owe her a very great deal. What I'm saying, not entirely clearly I'm sure, is that Margaret's approach to her archive of war was singular and very different from the orthodoxy of the Comité historians. In a wonderful piece in her Ego-Histoire, she describes how, in her then methodological impasse, she went to the Brotherton Library in Leeds and on the off chance looked up Lettres Françaises, not expecting to find them there. I quote her, and yet there it was, Les Lettres Françaises Clandestines, facsimile edition, housed in the closed special collection section. Because it was deemed to fall within the 50-year copyright regulations, only one article per issue could be photocopied. So I copied out all 19 issues by hand. This effortful process, copying out by hand the articles in all 19 issues, suggests a direct engagement with the materiality of her study, resulting in what she described, as I quote her, a detailed, intimate conversation with the articles of Les Lettres Françaises over several months. Today, of course, Les Lettres Françaises is digitally accessible on Gallica. You can take screenshots of all the articles. Thinking of Margaret's archive, I started to wonder, though, what difference this context of digitalisation makes to new generations of researchers. In other words, is the materiality of an archive more than simply, for us historians, the content of its record? The architect Susan Yee described her research encounters at the Le Corbusier archive in Paris, and her reaction when the archivist proudly told her that they were digitalising the archive. I quote her, "If I had accessed this drawing from home, I would never have known that it was stored separately, carefully rolled, that it was dirty with smudges and fingerprints. Looking at the curator's scans made me think respectfully about mass consumption, about allowing everyone to have access, about the technical problems of how to use a cursor to move around the drawing on the screen, and about how differently I understood the digital image and the designer behind it." The materiality of an archive is also surely a matter of engaging with its geographical location and proximal cultural environment, something that seems to resonate in Margaret's work. Douglas Johnson, reviewing one of the great Richard Cobb's books, noted Cobb's comparison between two investigative trades, that of historian and that of detective. I quote Johnson, "The historian, arriving in the small French provincial town, looking around the cafes before proceeding to the archives, and the detective, Maigret, putting his nose to the wind and getting the feel of the place." Johnson says, "It is deeply moving to find Cobb quoting Georges Lefebvre's feeling that the supreme satisfaction was that of untying the string on the bundle of archives in the attic of a village mairie." As Laura Putnam suggests, digital research can offer the historian what might be termed a disintermediated sort of discovery. Disintermediated. Algorithms will do the fact fetching for us, so that bricks and mortar, regional expertise, or immersive reading are much less necessary. What is happening here, I often think, and I felt this myself when I have relied solely on digitised records, is research which is essentially decontextualised, without place, and thus perhaps without experiential awareness. Things happen in archives and libraries along the way to them, Putnam says. For historians at least, place-specific learning is no longer necessarily baked into the processes of archival research. By staking much on accessibility, we have remade the information landscape for researchers, although arguably power relations between the Anglophone world and the rest still remain. However, in doing this, the link between information and location, the place that that information is about, can find itself severed. I think it's a particular worry in doing transnational history. I think, sitting in my office in Cambridge, I can look at archives in Venezuela, never having been, never having seen what the archives look like, nor how the archives have been collected. The corpus of Margaret's extensive, and I think pioneering work, demonstrates the importance of place and time, practices which have been vital to the epistemology and ethics of our research. Possibly I'm exhibiting here, and I accept the potential criticism, a sort of romance, a nostalgia of the archives, even perhaps a self-aggrandizement of the researcher. We legitimately have our own stories as researchers, and the archives themselves. In my case, their foreignness and intractability, the cultural norms around them, the other eccentrics you meet, the cafe life on the borders, and yes, the red ribbon tying up the papers of war, are all part of the stories we have as researchers. I like to think that alongside the foundational historiographical orthodoxy of the Comité d'Histoire de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, which I described, is Margaret the researcher, sitting in the Brotherton Library in Leeds, in a dialogue with lettres françaises, which would form the basis of the seminal work we've been discussing today. And I'll finish with a quote from her. To have this detailed, intimate conversation with the articles of les lettres françaises over several months opened the door to me. It was vital in relation to understanding the cultural politics of the resistance. It illuminated the importance of literature as a primary battleground. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? That's a concern. About the volume. My name's David Platten. I'm one of the Leeds crew. Worked and a friend of Margaret for many, many years. I'm pressed into action here as an emergency chair, fairly late on replacement, so no notes or preparation really. So you'll have to excuse that. It's my great pleasure, firstly, to introduce Professor Claire Gorrara at Cardiff University. Claire and I've known each other for a long time, as you probably all know. Claire started out, still is a specialist on occupation, literary occupation, women writing in particular, moved on and wrote probably the first book in English language on French crime fiction. I think it is actually. Anyway. And he's gone on to do lots of brilliant things since then. He's also one of the numerous colleagues here who not only prosecuted a brilliant research career, but have more than done their bit to try and help promote teaching of modern languages in the tertiary sector in this country. Claire was chair of the UCL now, isn't it? No, UCL. And now I last spoke to you, talked about making jam and doing other things, but now she's nonetheless, she's now Dean of Research and Innovation at Cardiff University. So, and today she's speaking about a novel by Eddie Thomas, which I think Claire will tell you about, that has a very deep connection with Margaret.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks so much. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about incendiary women, look at Edith Thomas and the cultural politics of the resistance. It's inspired by Margaret's work, again discussed previously by Hilary and by Mike, and the enjoyment I have for women who write war. And it's certainly a choice and a perspective that Margaret sparked into being, and that she's supported throughout my career as a very, very key mentor to me in my career thus far. So I'm going to talk about how I first came to Edith Thomas. And really, I was introduced to her in Margaret's final year module on French literature and the occupation. Ruth is in the room here today. And what you can see here is a lovely picture of Edith Thomas plus my bibliography from that course in 1989. Because Margaret would type them out, photocopy them, and you've got here my handwritten notes on this module, French literature and the occupation. And in this first class, we read Edith Thomas' short story, Le Tireur, The Vine Tree, in parallel with their course iconic Le Silence de la Mer. Remember that we analysed the figure of the sympathetic German in Le Tireur and their course Le Silence de la Mer, and looked at narrative forms of resistance. I thought she should go on to elaborate so successfully in her first book, developed for her PhD, and again, Hilary has some beautifully described and discussed and analysed earlier on. And I'm pretty sure Ruth will know there was a course assignment on these two short stories, and I'm pretty sure I wrote my assignment on this short story. Then, 30 years later, and it isn't that long, 30 years later, I introduced Edith Thomas' short story collection, which Le Tireur figures, Contes d'Auxoir, in my own final year module on the occupation of French culture. And I was inspired by Margaret's teaching and research on slavery, and then to bring in women's voices to the fore. At the time, it wasn't easy because there were no recent editions. You've got on the right here a recent edition in bilingual translation, done through the MLA text and translation, but there was, as it were, no English translation before that. So indeed, when we did Le Tireur in 1989 in Leeds with Margaret, it was actually written out by her, Hilary, from her visits to the BNF or elsewhere, because there were no texts available to be able to read it in its original form, in its conventional form. 30 years later, this collection fired the imagination of my students and went to all 7 Henderson short stories, and that Margaret analysed as what she called literature of persuasion. a wartime corpus of prose and poetry that declaimed and modelled a purposeful and persuasive stance of wartime resistance. In this paper, I want to revisit this collection about short stories about ordinary people's lives under occupation, and through the prism of Margaret's work on wartime and post-war writing of and about the resistance. As with her, Margaret's research was path-breaking. She recuperated wartime texts dismissed as ephemeral, whose real-time response to history in the making was supposed to make them lack critical distance and not be worthy of study. Margaret's work analysed literary structures in such writing and proposed what she would call, as my next slide here, what she would call literature with a mission, a purpose, not grounded in literary values alone. And I've used that many times in student titles on my course, because that's a great way to get the students to think about how literature relates to that wider immediate context. But I suppose what she called the historical real of occupied France, she read such literature surfacing what Vichy and Nazi propaganda sought to conceal, what she called the properly unspeakable. This was the violence of everyday military occupation and counterinsurgency, the conditions and deprivation of everyday life, rationing and the relève scheme, which I'll come back to, the persecution and deportation of Jews, and the Holmes concentration camps in the East. In opposition to this officially sanctioned source, Margaret argued for the value of literature promoting the enduring power of Western humanism, deeply embedded in French history and culture. For her it was a call to arms, to take personal responsibility for what was happening in the here and now. This was for her a commitment, patriotic, to France, that encompassed all political doctrines including international commerce. So in Margaret's work around literature and French resistance, Le Conte d'Oxford is a recurrent literary reference, and she reads it as exemplifying the cultural politics that was central to her thesis. And these focused on, in particular, characters moving from ignorance to knowledge as they came to understand their responsibility to resist. The surfacing of the historical real as it breaks through the veneer of everyday life and normality. I'm asking the figure of the enemy, not necessarily to sing along national lines. There are good Germans in this fiction and bad French people. And there are Western traditions and literature as a spur to action. And Margaret, as Hilary has so beautifully pointed out today, was looking at literary structures, belief systems, shared by French or sort of clandestine fiction, whose témoignage, they're witnessing, would resonate with wartime readers approaching the text under duress and danger. Now, since Margaret's groundbreaking work in 1989, others have deepened the work on Thomas's wartime writing. Guy Holmes here today has explored the subversion of the romance plot in Thomas's wartime stories, where romance and love are relinquished in favour of political action. Angela Kershaw has read Conte d'Oxford, positioning Thomas as with a tradition of left-leaning, 20th century committed women intellectuals. Others like Dorothy Catherine, Thomas's post-war biographer, have seen Thomas's post-war writing as a reflection mirror of her own actions and those of her close friends. But I want to take in quite a different tack. I want to build on Margaret's sense of fiction and resistance, looking at the historical real. I want to ask the question, what would it mean to read a short story collection as a form of history writing? From this optic, Thomas's Conte d'Oxford is both a témoignage, but also a narrative actively shaping historical consciousness and historical legacy. So I'm going to ask two questions in this paper today. The first one is, how does Thomas write the history of the resistance in 1943, so when it's happening? I'm going to take as literal truth the subtitle to the collection, which is, and I'll go back here, which is Transcrit du réel, transcribed from reality. So we're going to have a look at them. I'm going to develop a subtext there as text about that. So how does it mean to write, in many ways, an early social history of the resistance in the form of 7 clandestine short stories? Secondly, I want to ask, how were resistors portrayed? I'm going to read the collection as one inflected by Thomas's keen sense of women as unacknowledged historical and social actors. As I hope to show, Thomas's representation of women in Conte d'Oxford preempts the findings of later generations of historians of women and resistors. It is really quite accurate one-to-one correlation. I also believe by speculating on how Thomas's wartime experiences as a resistor can be traced in her later work as a social historian, above all, Les Pétroleuses, The Women Incendiaries of my title, 1962. This is a collected history or biography of women of the Paris Commune. It counters the myth and unpacks it of working class women as violent insurrectionaries. So a social history and also an early feminist recuperation in the moment of it happening of women's resistance. So Conte d'Antoine is really a writing history in its very, very format from the get-go. It's a short story collection. Thomas does not choose to write a novella, a long-form piece of writing, but instead seven vignettes or snapshots of life in occupied France. And each features unassuming characters who, in all but one case, confound the image of the male armed military fighter with the common and dominant narrative resistance in the post-war period. Now, of course, the choice of the short story form is partly a feature of clandestine publishing, with paper shortages and an imperative to produce short and very targeted narratives that can be printed and distributed at speed. However, the form also codes resistance as, use the term here, a people's war, where a cast of characters from agricultural workers and factory workers to primary school teachers and university professors all embody a resistance spirit. There is no omniscient narrator, although the reader is very much guided through the text with clear political perimeters. In many ways, you are, as a reader, a sense maker of history, alongside intermediate protagonists who come to recognise the urgency of resistance. In all 7 short stories in this collection, women are absolutely central, either as a main character or as actors in a social network within which male figures come to adopt a resistance mindset or take up arms. And the diversity of women's resistance circumstances is absolutely carefully chosen and considered. They are, for example, professional women. They are fiancées, they are wives, they're mothers, they're retirees. And then having a variety of contexts, from the streets of Paris to the farms and fields of rural France. And they come from across the class divide, in shaping our resistance as a patriotic war against vichy and the occupier. And this ties so well with Mike's comments from looking at one was about unity in diversity. That is precisely what this short story collection exemplifies. Of course, it would have been influenced by Thomas's then affiliation to the French Communist Party as a member, but that story of that coding of that common people's war is a very strong one. But what's really key to all of these short stories is the depiction of women as the binding agents of resistance. They build, they repair the social infrastructure that makes resistance possible through information gathering, logistical support and liaison. They undertake the physical and emotional labour of supporting others to take up arms where there is hesitancy, and they co-opt the domestic space, the home front, for resistance. I'm going to have now a look at 2 short stories in the collection where this social women and the research ecosystem are very carefully charted out by Edith Thomas. And the first one is La Relève. Now this short story focuses on the character of Robert Bazin, a skilled factory worker who is confronted daily with Vichy propaganda to leave to work in Germany for a war effort for the Relève scheme. This scheme will reportedly lead to the release of 1 French prisoner of war for every 3 workers that leave, and that was the propaganda, that was the ask of the population. Thomas sets out in the short story the opposing views on the Relève scheme as Bazin, the main character, debates or rather listens to his fellow factory workers arguing about the scheme in the bistro opposite the hotel. Leaving to work in Germany could be, and is for one person, an altruistic act, as we see here. Mais tout de même, si on peut délivrer quelqu'un, ça vaut de la peine, même si on ne peut pas le délivrer ceux qu'on connaît. For others, it's an adventure, for the young and the hot-headed. For others, still more, it's a journey of duty and it's patriotic to hear the injunctions of Margaret Atack. As the numbers for Germany dwindle, the unimaginable happens to Robert and he uses his call-up papers to go to the Gare de l'Est to leave for Germany. And Thomas presents here with skill and sympathy the space of public debate and the whole social context into which you make the decision to resist or not. No choice is simple. It's not a simple story. There's alternate points of view here for you to debate as the reader. But in sharp contrast to Robert's inner turmoil, his girlfriend Simone is adamant when he delivers the news. Il ne peut pas partir, ne part pas. Just as Robert's internal monologue has been one with questions, obviously specific indicators of hesitancy and not being able to decide, Simone's voice is one of command and action. She offers to hide Robert at her aunt's house in the countryside and to dive into an alternative hidden resistance world that he has not perceived before, to draw back the veil of the resistance in the historical real. It's not a story about retreating into the domestic space, avoiding your responsibility. It's about preparing for armed insurrection, as the last time the story makes clear when Simone says, quand il faudra sortir le fusil et les mitrailleuses, alors je ne te retiendrai plus. By acting as Robert's confidant and accomplice, Simone becomes the catalyst for Robert's resistance conversion. So in contrast, women as a support network, the emotional trigger point, catalyst for resistance, we have l'arrestation, who have women as active resistors. In the opening pages, Anne Roger is agonising at her mother's bedside as she recuperates from hospital surgery. As she reflects on her mother's precarious health, this is a metaphor for the nation, obviously, an alien person in a hospital, she hears boots approaching in the clinic corridor. And as Margaret talked with them in our seminar, those boots are a metonymic device for the German oppression. Yeah. And this is what happens as Anne's moment of self-reckoning happens. The moment she knows qu'elle a savoir réellement ce qu'elle valait. You know, she has to confront German officers in uniform asking to accompany her to her apartment to search it for compromising papers. Thomas accentuates the gender dynamic in the scene. Elle était debout devant eux, très petite devant eux, mais prête à leur tenir tête. And the game of predator and prey begins and begins to calculate how she can use her next move to circumvent or avoid further interrogation. As she leaves the clinic, Anne is part of a world of women. There are nurses, hospital orderlies, her mother, and at home her maid Mariette. And this world of women is all a protective shield for this female liaison agent, as we find out. While the Germans search for compromising papers, Anne begins to think about how she'll parry the verbal blows. Comme un boxeur, qu'elle a l'habitude de recevoir des coups et de les surmonter. Here a masculine metaphor for her inner strength. It also Anne plays to her audience, playing the role of the innocent woman. Faire la bête et la naïf, dire non, as she denies all accusations. Non, elle n'avait jamais entendu parler de cette conspiration, de cette réunion, de cette traite. When she's led away from interrogation in the final pages, Thomas again will use that metaphor device of shoes to indicate Anne's bravery and her fighting spirit. Puis ses talons résonnèrent dans l'entrée aussi durement que leurs bottes, so she can actually confront those German officers. Now, written in 1943, these two short stories and a whole collection preempt, I would say, the work of historical women who have challenged the dominant masculine story of an armed resistance insurrection. Firstly, Thomas' short story collection draws out the gender dynamics of resistance as uncovered by historical women many decades later. From the 1980s onwards, we have people like Paul Schwartz, already mentioned, Dominique Veillant, Rita Talman, and Margaret Collins-Weiss, who attempted to have indeed redefined concepts of resistance to incorporate the often unseen and unrecognised contribution of women and the essential role of the civic resistance. As Claire Andrieux has astutely commented, women of resistance both mobilised traditional social codes that put them in the space of the home, for example, the homemaker and the mother, and they also subverted them to instrumentalise feminine roles to great effect, in other words, hiding in plain sight. The figure of the liaison agent, who masks their activism and avoids detection by playing to gender stereotypes such as Anne in L'Arrestation, have been a particularly rich stream of analysis. And it's been studied in a transnational frame by Juliet Pattinson in her research on female agents in the British SOE organisation. So again, you've got a short story of Thomas that really, in very many ways, preempts this work around gender dynamics and the way that women were using, or able to use and subvert social stereotypes for resistance activism. Secondly, Thomas's collection highlights the role of women as the vital support structures for resistance. This has been mirrored again, come back to Von Kedron and Hannah Diamond. This has been mirrored in historical methodologies alive to everyday life in wartime France. For historians such as Von Kedron and Hannah Diamond, investigating women's lived experiences has offered a valuable axis for examining choices and constraints in occupied France. Kedron famously coined the term "the woman at the doorway," a very important term here. For those women he interviewed, who sustained the maquis through covering for their absent menfolk and providing supplies and provisions that kept resistance networks going. This recasting of the resistance has opened a space to understand it as an alternate society, an underground world, working alongside accommodating the Vichy regime. Like Simone in Hilary, resistance here is about deflection and concealment, with women as a first-line defence in their home, trying to deceive and defy the authorities to support a loved one or a accomplice. Again, in Hilary, this is Simone. She is this woman at the doorway in the apartment helping her lover to avoid detection by using her aunt, another woman, to create that sort of link of conspiration and the link of subversion. So published in 1943, Conduct Soir can be read as an action history of the resistance, shaped by its conditions of production. At the time of writing, Thomas was a member of the clandestine Comité National des Écrivains, the only woman member, and a fellow editor and writer of the Lettres Françaises, indeed the preeminent literary clandestine journal. Published by l'Édition de Minuit, Conduct Soir is written from within the prescribed worldview of international communism. As a then member of the French Communist Party, Thomas, of course, was promoting the resistance as a forerunner of a broader victory for the working classes. This communist-reflected worldview of a people's war shapes Thomas's egalitarian perception of resistance and women at all of its different social strata. Yet in many ways, it's also grounded in an understanding of the unacknowledged role of women as political actors, actors who are making an equal sacrifice for the nation, but who did not yet have the right to vote. That would come in April 1944. This is history writing, in my view, in a campaigning mode, where French resistors had been trying to test in adversity and had earned the hard-won right to a political platform. Going on as the war came to an end, Thomas would write a short commemorative history of the liberation of Paris in 1945. She spent much of the wartime period thinking about her own experience, about others. And in the 1990s, a posthumous biographer, Margaret Atack, edited a post-war memoir, Le Témoin Compromis, and published extracts from her occupation diary. And this is followed by a really extraordinary text that she wrote in Thomas, Le Journal Intime de Monsieur Costaday, Mrs. Celestin Costaday, a fictionalized diary of a pompous, Vichy-supporting bourgeois provincial. It literally is her nemesis. It's an incredible, as it were, recasting the occupation from within the worldview of somebody completely antithetical to Edith Thomas. You can really inhabit different worldviews at the same time. But I want to finish by looking briefly at one of Thomas's post-war social histories, Les Pétroleuses, the Women Incendiaries, a collective biography of the women of the Paris Commune of 1870. And I want to argue here in this last part that this history writing that we see allows Thomas to reinvent and redraw her resistance to the past into observations about how women have been neglected and left out of the historical record. So the Pétroleuses forms part of Thomas's post-war oeuvre as a social historian. By the 1960s, Thomas has largely abandoned writing fiction. The novel writing before the war, post the war, only writes one novel, writes a whole series of historical biographies. And these are all bar one biographies of women, covering a vast historical sweep, from Joan of Arc to Georges Sand, Pauline Roland, and Louise Michel, all with an explicitly feminist perspective. And what makes the Pétroleuses stand out is Thomas's explicit reference to her lived experience of the war and how it's woven into her interpretation and analysis of the women communards. So at the very first, the Pétroleuses marks a shift in Thomas's writing that we've moved from the margins as secondary protagonists or supporters to the very centre of the analysis. Thomas undertakes meticulous archival research into the lives of the women of the Paris Commune. This encompasses the dossiers of the Councils of War in the archives of the Ministry of War, to the reprieve dossiers in the National Archives documenting the trials of women who were indeed tried for their role in the Paris Commune. In this way, Thomas recreates the lives of largely working class women, but not only working class, also bourgeois women and non-French nationals, who have not even received a footnote in history. In addition, she sees substantial proportions of her texts from published works, providing a platform posthumously for their voices. So you literally get very large sections actually give you verbatim the words of those women from over 100 years ago, not just the greatest of the lost in history. It's a rich social history and portrayal of a generation of women who have been miscast as harpies and fire starters. And those are there in great detail. We have their birthplace, their education, their professions, including prostitution, marital status, political actions, writings and post-colonial lives. Some went to penal colonies in New Caledonia. And also their legacies in poetry and novels. Gorrara and Hugo are in the conclusion, we actually commemorate the lives of Louise Michel in the text. Unlike Thomas's wartime writings, which rely on imagination and social observation, this is history writing indebted to Thomas's training as an archivist, with her acute sense of how much women's lives have not been kept in the archives. And that's the first quote there. I read the text in English, by the way, it's in the Cardiff Library, so it's in English. So what becomes of the other women of the Union? Now that the archives of what about SEM or the National Archive that preserve complete files on the sentenced communals? How was the choice made? What criteria was applied for those files that were destroyed? Historians always work with a mere fraction of the material left to them by chance or arbitrary choice. It's like the story of the women of the French resistance. Thomas here pulls actually back from historical oblivion. Secondly, the experience of women in the French resistance allows Thomas to make trans-historical connections between the war years and the Paris Commune as of a period of France's defeat by Germany. That's my next slide here. What allows me perhaps to understand the Commune is that during this resistance I took part in the coordinating committee of the Union des Femmes Françaises, edited their tracts and helped them to plan the women's demonstrations against the Vichy government and the Nazi occupation. The barricades of 1944 replied to the barricades of 1871. So we can see a Republican tradition of popular insurrection and barricades at Parisian streets provides a connecting thread. And this is very clearly a gender experience, as she makes abundantly clear. Cold, hunger, queues at the doors of shops. My generation has done all that, but in 1871 our grandmothers experienced much worse. Again, a matrilineal story, our grandmothers experienced much worse. By connecting 1871, Tom encounters the stereotype of the pétroleurs as indiscriminate fire starters. She co-opts their actions to a French tradition of popular revolt. This is a consummate feminist demystification, as she leads backwards to echo the resistance of the Second World War in the history of the Paris Commune. So to conclude then, I want to conclude by looking at connecting Margaret and Edith. As Donald Bloxham has argued, it is impossible to remove moral judgments, or at least moral impressions that imply or evoke moral judgments from historical accounts. Bloxham refutes the doctrine of moral neutrality. In other words, historians have no right to make moral judgments about the past. He's looked at what he calls moral prompts in all historical scholarship, that is, historians do not record or interpret neutrally, but constantly evaluate the past. Edith Thomas fully assumed this stance in the pétroleuse writing, but objectivity is a decoy, particularly when we are concerned with periods that are near to us and touch upon problems that are burning issues. This is likely out of sync with the Donna Annan school of writing, which she was writing in the 1960s. And the outcome is an incisive and groundbreaking micro-history of women of the Paris Commune who've been effectively written out of history. In a self-deprecating tone, Thomas reflects on her own contrary historical practice by saying, for my part, I have tried to do something else, probably not entirely successfully, to break up the masses into their elements, to reach the individual cells that compose them. The documents are incomplete, sketchy, and inadequate. I have come across names and actions, but who were Elisabeth Latif, Eugénie Soutienne, Eulalie Papavoine? Those humble women held to a great cause. In the end, no one will ever know. Yet by paying attention to what and who were unvoiced, Thomas shines a light on stories and sources routinely underrepresented in historical accounts. Like, in many ways, we can say women in the French resistance. Many translated Margaret's work on literature and the French resistance. Both Margaret and Edith sought to understand systems of representation that determine how history is written, by whom, and for what purpose. Career long, they were committed to recuperating the stories of protagonists, often women, who were unrecognised. In many ways, like Margaret, inspired generations of work to come after them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Shall we follow the format this morning and move to our second speaker? Also, needs no introduction to most people here. I should imagine Professor Emerita, Professor Debra Kelly, University of Westminster. Also, I think, Senior Fellow at King's as well. A pioneer in the study of war and culture in relation to France, worked extensively on French presence in London, French communities within London, and also, I think, on food as well. Interesting food. And again, this should also be recognised, another one of our colleagues who's worked tirelessly to help promote French studies and French in universities through your work on world building and language acts. So, over to you, Deb.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me just fiddle with this. And okay, thank you. First of all, hello everyone, and I really am honoured to be invited to speak today. Should I do this better? Yeah. I really am honoured to speak today. I didn't know Margaret or work with Margaret as extensively as a lot of the people here today, but the groundwork has been set for the way I work and the material that I'm going to present, and people will see the connections for themselves. I won't need to point them out. So on a personal note, I will begin, like others, by saying that Margaret's work was very much, I mean, she was a pioneer in this, and the book that we've heard a lot about today, the literature and the French resistance, and I think the subtitle is really, really important, the cultural politics, the narrative forms. And it's one of the first things that I read when we were conceiving the work of the Group for War and Culture Studies in the early, mid-90s. So thank you, Hilary, for the reminder of all that work. And actually, I had forgotten that Margaret was a contributor to the very first issue of the Journal of War and Culture Studies. And to put that in a bit of context, the first issue really was a set of position papers, which we'd sent out a call for. But we invited 3 full articles, and Margaret had to be amongst those full articles in the first issue. And so she was a pioneer and a fellow traveller in that work. And I and other members and associates of the group always received a very warm welcome in Leeds and at other events with which she was involved. So what I'm presenting today is framed then by Margaret's approaches across her career to literature, the resistance and the occupation. So, as I say, the book that's been much referenced today, understandably. More general to French fiction by women, and also to the work undertaken on new readings, which underpinned the Frame research group which she led, investigating fictional narratives of the Second World War and occupation in France, 1939 to 2009, identifying large numbers of novels which had disappeared from literary historical knowledge. So again, very important project. And the conference in Leeds around that middle book there, and its subsequent publication in 2012, were very much on my mind when thinking about today. So what follows is not new research, I must confess, but it's work that was mainly carried out while writing for and co-editing the third text you see there, which is A History of the French in London, Liberty, Equality, Opportunity, 2013. But what today has allowed me to do is to revisit and rethink the rewards of looking for and listening carefully to everyday voices during wartime and other momentous days, and I'll come back to that epigraph in a moment. Voices and experience which are less heard, and in this case, those of women, and I think I couldn't have been set up better than by Claire's paper, as well as what we heard this morning about Margaret's approaches. So what I'm kind of stubbornly doing today with the material that I'm going to present, which the material is wonderful, but the approaches which I haven't intellectualised, I have to say, that work's been done for me. So we're going to move from occupied France to free France in London. And while prominence is given by many historians of the period to its key figures and to the political and military events of the period, very much as we've heard about historiography of the occupation. Knowledge of the ordinary, generally very young men and women who joined de Gaulle, and indeed of those who chose to join Free France while remaining wary of the Gaullist vision and ambitions, a knowledge of their everyday lives in London is much more fragmentary, dispersed in memoirs, diaries, letters, autobiographical and semi-autobiographical novels and photographs, and these are housed in various public and private archives. It's quite a task, again, as we've heard, dealing with these archives and the different status attributed to them. I was most interested in the traces of people not often found among the usual subjects of academic research, and in mapping their experiences of real places and spaces alongside the iconic images of wartime London. One of the most engaging sources which I uncovered when working on the London French colony and the Free French in wartime London was a trilogy of lightly fictionalised narratives by a French woman who had been living in London since the early 1920s. Madeleine Gall, who married English journalist Robert Henry, often published under the name Mrs. Robert Henry for the novels on which they worked together. As the epigraph I've used here for the title, books that record great events do not explain how ordinary people of a great city live during momentous days. Her work provides a way of into considering the everyday experience and writings of a range of French citizens living in London during the Second World War, whether already resident in the city or those who arrived to become members of the Free French. So this takes in, for example, French women belonging to London's French colony, established since the 19th century, and which would undergo significant changes due to the war. Prominent figures such as Madame Simon Prunier, Prunier's very fashionable seafood restaurant in St James's Street, and a range of young women of the Free French Corps des Volontaires Françaises, including Thérèse Del Torres in her published diary, Une Française Libre, not published until 2000, incidentally, and her rather infamous best-selling pulp novel, Women's Barracks, which was published in 1950. A woman like Jeanne Hart, née Ducruet, married to an Englishman like Madeleine Henry, living in southeast London before the war, who worked as a telephonist at de Gaulle's headquarters, and whose Free French diary, and this is a commercially published printed diary, her Free French diary for 1944 gives her work address and phone number as Fighting French Headquarters, 4 Carlton Gardens, Whitehall 5444. And Yvonne Salmon, who many of you will know, General Secretary of the Alliance Française, a lecturer in French at Reading University, who worked both for the Société des Français du Grande-Bretagne, a kind of civil wing of the Free French, and at Carlton Gardens, and who wrote an early biography of de Gaulle, and Leslie Boyd, née Gerard from Douglas in the Isle of Man, who had spent time in France before the war, and who much preferred life in the barracks of the Corps des Volontaires Françaises to the training in the British Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS. I think she found that rather grueling, and she preferred the meals that the French women volunteers received, which we'll see. Okay, so Madeleine Henry, first of all, and a trilogy of novels. A Village in Piccadilly, 1942, Incredible City, 1944, Siege of London, 1946. So Madeleine Gall, 1906 to 2004, was born into a poor family in Clichy, northern Paris. Her father had been a miner and a First World War soldier, and she and her seamstress mother moved to London shortly after his death. They lived in Soho, and the young Madeleine worked in the newsagents there. I'm pretty sure I know which one, because there was a newsagents in Soho with a lot of foreign language newspapers that endured for decades, and I have a feeling that's where Madeleine worked. She also worked in a city silk merchant's office and then as a manicurist at the Savoy. She married one of her clients, Robert Henry, an Italian who became a journalist, and the marriage considerably elevated her social status. Her account of 1930s London, The Foolish Decade, published in 1945, so at the end of the war, is populated by a wide variety of London French members of the French colony, established since the 19th century, and numbering around 30,000 in 1901, according to the French language newspaper La Chronique de Langres. That's considerably more than the census suggests, but I think La Chronique de Langres was on the ground and knew better than the census. The material is clearly autobiographical, lived experience transposed into narrative, and she wrote a number of other autobiographically based novels in English, the most widely read of which is The Little Madeleine, 1955, concerning her childhood. Now, during the war, Madeleine, her husband and young son lived in a flat in Shepherd's Market in Mayfair, and she proves a really very vivid witness to life in London from 1940 onwards. She published under the name Mrs. Robert Henry, although the early novels sometimes appear actually without the Mrs., so when you're tracking them down, it's another issue. Her son Bobby, who appears in the war novels, he's still alive and lives in Florida, confirmed in an interview last year the close writing collaboration between husband and wife, with Madeleine being the one who engaged, talked to and observed a whole range of people in the London around her, which she knew so well, bringing home material for them to work on together. But some of the novel's concerns and knowledge are clearly those of a journalist. And it's no surprise that the main narrator is a male English newspaper columnist. And of the Savoy, in June 1940, we read in a village in Piccadilly, and it's worth reading in full because this is an example of one of their very evocative scenes, which packs in so much social, cultural, as well as political observation and commentary. So the restaurant overlooking the Thames and the embankment remained open, but its normal atmosphere had gone. The city folk who normally patronise it at lunchtime, spending their money lavishly on brandy and cigars, seemed to have faded away. In place of them, one met groups of Poles, Dutchmen, Belgians, Norwegians, and a few American newspapermen who'd just crossed over from France. General de Gaulle, almost unknown as yet, held court at a large round table. French diplomats from the embassy and members of the various naval, military and economic missions, who nearly all intended to obey the instructions of the Pétain government, kept as far away from the new leader as possible, and even glared at him with undiplomatic rudeness. They intended to insist on their safe conduct home as soon as possible. It's the kind of insight that you don't get in many memoirs, I have to say. There's this, it's acute and it's personal, and in fact I haven't got that photograph in this slideshow, but then there are photographs of those people, of the diplomatic mission at the embassy, piling onto trains. They can't get out of London quick enough, and they court there in the Savoy. The author cautions that there was no glamour about this international crowd. It was sombre and depressed in the big entrance hall. They moved about like ghosts, shattered and bewildered by the complete and utter wreckage of their homelands. And a little further, again, sorry it's such a long quote, but this material is so alive. We read, again, it's the Savoy Hotel. They seem to have spent quite a lot of time hanging around the Savoy, rather like de Gaulle did, actually. Passing through the foyer at about 5 o'clock one evening, I saw a dozen shabby figures walking in Indian file into the reading room. What struck me first about them were their bent and lifeless backs. They looked as if they were being led to the gallows by a member of the Gestapo. I saw them sink limply into the settees. Soon their heads were close together as they talked and argued in low tones. Suddenly I recognised familiar faces in this little crowd. Yes, indeed, they were France's most famous war and political correspondents, men and women whose names were known throughout the world and whom I'd met personally on every great international news story during the last 20 years. But what an unbelievable change had come over them. The frail white-haired woman was Geneviève Tabry of the Paris Oeuvre, whom the Nazis only a few days before had claimed to have captured. There was Eddie Bois, gruff but dynamic, brave and honest editor-in-chief, of the huge circulation, the Petit Parisien. And there was Pertinax, André Géraud was his actual name, considered by the Anglo-American press as an oracle. They had caused governments to fall and called their own cabinet ministers by their Christian names. Now they covered the greatest story of all, but the story was too big and had burned them up. They had no longer any papers in which to write what they had seen. They had no longer any country to call their own. They would soon have to leave the hotel, no longer having large expenses to draw upon. Many of them, like Madame Tubby, planned to move into cheap lodgings until they could obtain permission to leave for New York. It's kind of just so truthful and gets to the core of how people were living. That, anyway, is my reading. And these are not the observations and commentaries to be found in the well-known accounts and memoirs of the Free French in London, by de Gaulle himself, of course, but also those by Camille Briac, Colonel Passy, Pierre Bloch, the list goes on. A number of French personalities populate Madeleine Henry's novels, either fleetingly in single encounters or as recurring characters which provide a running thread throughout the narrative as the war progresses. For example, Charles Picquart, the French consul, recalled by Vichy, encountered in a small Georgian house, almost facing the consulate in Bedford Square, or the Paris industrialist, now calling himself Mr. James, with his story of how he managed to join the last French nationals being evacuated by a British ship. And notably, Pierre Brossolette, first introduced to readers as Lavoisier in the second novel of the trilogy, The Incredible City, published in 1944, written before the liberation of France. Now, Brossolette is an interesting example because his story is well known to historians of the Second World War and the Free French. But the lens through which it's observed in Madeleine Henry's work is very personal. It's seen through the experiences and his relationships to his wife, his children, how he's going to school them when they're in London, these kind of details, and friends. And finally, the journalist also lunches with Yvonne Salmon at the Free French headquarters, and again it gives a very different insight into what went on there. The Free French occupied a modern building in old-fashioned and spacious Carlton Gardens, and Londoners who passed along this normally quiet backwater had become accustomed to seeing staff cars with French soldiers or sailors at the wheel, and the sentry marching back and forth below the tricolour above the entrance. The mess was on the top of the building, and through the wide windows one had a sweeping view of London, over London. The office was served by women volunteers with the cross of the rain into their breasts. There were strange, moving stories to be heard here. Escapes from France in homemade aeroplanes, in fishing boats, even in barrels. During lunch, Mademoiselle Selmon reads out a letter from her younger brother in Brest. And this prompts other staff in the Free French headquarters to bring out theirs to share. The personal experience within momentous events is always to the fore. Such narratives suggest that while the memoirs written by the Frenchmen who lived in London during the war occasionally name-check the places in which they lived, socialised, or more often met to discuss high politics, it's actually these women who are more detailed chroniclers of everyday life, revealing more of both public and private spaces, and often just as much of the politics of the day, sometimes explicitly and sometimes obliquely. And I think we've also just heard some of that. So my second example is Madame Simon Prunier of Prunier's Seafood Restaurant. Another very different and really quite powerful French woman also provides an account of wartime London in her memoir of the restaurant La Maison, which is in the middle of the slide. The wartime history of the London branch of the famous Parisian restaurant Prunier is well documented. So it's really a history of the restaurant, but of course there's this nugget of gold in the middle of it, which is about the war. And it had been on Madame Prunier's initiative that London Pruniers was established in early 1935 in St James's Street. Now, of course, Madame Prunier was cut off from her family during the war. She managed to keep the restaurant open despite bombing, the worst being on the 16th of April 1941, when there was considerable damage done to the premises. Despite meal prices fixed by the government, the very famous 5 shilling, the 5-bob meal, which was a limit of what restaurants could charge, necessary wage cuts, rationing, and refusing to be involved in the black market, more easily indulged by smaller restaurants with less high-profile clientele, she insists. And she refused to join the black market, even when offered assistance by a hero of free France, known in the resistance as the Commander Longley. As war approaches, first and then regular visits of von Ribbentrop, a long-time client of Pugnier's in Paris, are noted, as are the details of the Paris and London high society seasons of 1939. So one moment we're in high society London, and then on the morning of the 3rd of September, I went straight to St James's Street. The staff had gathered there too, and together we filled sandbags and erected barricades against bomb blast around the front of the restaurant. Those of the men who were French went off to the consulate to report for mobilisation. The mobilisation hit us hard. 3/4 of the cooks were French, and all were called to the colours. My restaurant manager, Guillaume, and my chef, Cauchois, were both in their 40s and fathers of families, but they too were ordered to leave at 3 days' notice. The previous day, a new French chef, Mr. Gadier, had reported for duty. It was only later that I learned he'd missed the wedding of his son, who was one of those called up so as not to let the maison down. Mr. Gadier brought some of his team with him. Older cooks come out of retirement, and a little personal aside, Mike, Adolphe Cadier, the chef, is the grandfather of your old colleague Linda Cadier at Southampton. And Linda confirmed that story. It was his son's wedding. It was the first one reported on by the Evening Standard after the outbreak of war. And in fact, she sent me a letter that had been sent to Chef Cadier by Escoffier. I don't know how I got into that conversation with her, but there we are. So we know this to be true. Madame Pugnier's view of the war through the prism of a great restaurant is a real insight into the London of the period. After Dunkirk, Madame Pugnier writes that the uniforms of the men who came into Pugnier's in St James's Street were sometimes a little creased and their faces more than a little worn. All the stories ended in retreat, always retreat. The days of June 1940, she writes, were humiliating for a French woman in London who has always been proud of her country. My English friends were kindness itself. They never reproached my country. They never even talked of capitulation. We've got a little bit different there once the right wing press got hold of it. But anyway, there we are. As a connection between our narrators here, in the first of Madeleine Honory's trilogy ends, as the narrator notes, officers in queer foreign uniforms were leaving Pugnier's after lunch, reminding one sadly that Paris for the Englishman was now thousands of miles away and more difficult of access than the plains of Tibet. While Madame Pugnier writes that the refugees, of course, flocked to St James's Street. Pierre Cotte, the former Radical Air Minister, appeared for lunch one day. Then it was Geneviève Tadji. She appears again, the diplomatic correspondent who set up to know the secrets of the chancelleries. When the final boats arrived from Bordeaux, some of the passengers came straight to my office. I mean, she cannot resist this woman. Simone Pugnier writes that she heard de Gaulle's appel du 18 juin, and on the 20th of June, with other conseillers du commerce extérieur, she attended a meeting. A little bit of context. In 1938, the French Ministry of Commerce gave Simone Pugnier this honorific title, and it was a distinction granted to French tradesmen abroad on the recommendation of the Conseil of the French Embassy to the country in which they worked. And this kind of commercial esteemed status was important. She was one of the first women to be nominated, and she was in fact one of only 12 women amongst 2,500 conseillers in the British section. Now I think it's an important detail, not just for that, but there were 2,500 French Londoners in London, important enough to receive that title. So when we talk about the 30,000 population, you start to see things in perspective and feel the truth of the matter of how many people were here. And finally, from Madame, almost finally from Madame Fournier, I voted for the sending of a letter to Mr. Churchill, thanking him for his proposal of an Anglo-French union and placing ourselves at his disposal. And naturally, I joined the Société des Français du Grande-Bretagne as soon as it was formed in July to support Debra. A few days before, a French friend had rung up to say that 100 members of the French colony in London, all good Frenchmen, were being invited to meet the journal at the YMCA building in Great Russell Street. In principle, it's for men only, but you're a man in skirts, he said. There was a platform where, in the room where the 100 of us gathered. The general mounted it with a certain reluctance and made a stiff little speech, and we filed up to shake hands with him, naming ourselves as we reached him. In her final assessment of the restaurant during the war, she writes, again, ever the name dropper, I have to say, do not think I would be boasting if I said that Prunier's in St James's Street had become one of the favourite restaurants of the various European resistance movements. John de Gaulle had been there, of course, so had André Déthen, the Strasbourg professor of law, Philippe, the young socialist and Jacques Souster, the young anthropologist, who were all to serve as ministers under him. Pierre Mendès France had eaten there in the RAF uniform he wore as a member of the Free French Squadron before he became a minister. Okay, so to close, let's go back to our ordinary women, our Free French women volunteers. And there's a couple of photographs there. They are marching through London, and there they are actually having some of these rather good meals in Montcorvo House that Leslie Gerard was so very fond of. And they, she talks about this at length in her letters. So, and again, we see the truth of it in the photograph, if you like. And Leslie Gerard's, this is not Leslie Gerard, this is just a random photograph of a young free French volunteer, but you know, you get the kind of image that they're projecting. And now Leslie's account, which we're going to close with, is much less torrid than Tereska Torres's rather infamous 1950 account of being in the Free French Forces. Torres did enlist with the Free French Forces, and she was a secretary of the officers of de Gaulle. Now, in the Free French, the life and love in the Free French Army, I think it was sold under. Again, I have to say, a bit like Madeleine Henry, but less benignly, but much more lucratively, there was a husband involved in the writing of this novel. So, to close, let's hear from one of our just ordinary, in inverted commas, women. So the very vivacious Leslie Gerard. She worked in various posts in the women's section of the Free French Army, including in the pay office and in provisions. And again, you know, as I said, she writes to her parents about everyday experiences like these rather good meals, served with wine, she stresses, at Montcorvo House and then Hacking House in any small gardens in Kensington. In fact, the original barracks was in Hill Street in Mayfair, the women's barracks, and it was bombed in April 1941, so more or less the same time as Madame Fournier's restaurant, which in fact wasn't very far away. Now, on a serious note, she includes in her papers in the Imperial War Museum an official document that lists all those women who were promoted to the grade of aspirant officer candidate on the 24th of July 1945. This makes me think of Edith Thomas listing those women and saying we'll never know who they are. And here's another list. So here they are, the list of women in 1945. Lucienne Gerard, Annie Gaillot, Denise Lacroix, Georgette Lafaille-Morfin, Suzanne Laurent-Roboul, Mars Martin, Julie Noézan, Gisèle Orget, Marie-Antoinette Paris, Dominique Roy, Denise Sarrault, and Leslie Gerard, out of alphabetical order, presumably because she's British. Now, they may have kind of displaced her, but she absolutely delights in her French status, as you see here. The last quote, you'll be relieved to know. So after VE Day on the 21st of May 1945, Leslie writes, one thing I noticed whenever we, including male companions, went in the restaurants, with my being in French uniform, it was me the waiters consulted for the choice of dish, wines, etc. Everyone seems fond of and strives to emulate the French somehow. Their opinions as regards food, etc. must be respected. I've gained a good deal of assurance through this, and I'm glad. And the previous year, she also shared with her parents what must have been a fairly innocent encounter, even though you might suggest otherwise. It's amazing what a difference the French uniform makes. It really gives you glamour. I got off with General Kern's driver yesterday, quite unintentionally, I assure you. Now, it's funny, but it's human, and I think this is what we've been trying to uncover, all day about that pioneering work that Margaret did. These témoignages, if you like, are poignant, they're truthful, they're vivid, they're insightful, they're compelling. So Madeleine Henry, Simone Pougnier, Leslie Gerard, very diverse but enduring narratives and momentous days, framed, to use the term that Margaret used, by women who are at once ordinary and extraordinary. And then, despite everything I've said, I thought we could do with an iconic image to end, with the Cross of Lorraine being flown next to St. Paul's to celebrate the liberation of Paris in August 1944, and it's an image that always sends a tingle down my spine. Thank you very much for your listening.
This is our final session, so 2 more papers, and then we're due to close proceedings at 5 o'clock. So it's my pleasure to introduce the 2 speakers to you. The first is Ruth Cruickshank from Royal Holloway, University of London. Ruth and Claire Gorrara, who we saw before, were at Leeds University, undergraduates at Leeds University at the same time, exactly the same time, wasn't it? 1985 to 1989, both taught by Margaret and me, actually. Yes.
You haven't said a bit about where we look young. Sorry.
Oh, yes. No, I look young. Oh, well, you yes. You did look young. You don't look any older, in fact. They both did Margaret's course, the famous Occupation in French Literature. Ruth then went to Electrice at Lyon 3. She was not in academia for a number of years after that, in advertising, I believe, and then saw the error of her ways and chose academia. Whether that was a good choice or not. She's now a reader in French and comparative literature and culture at Royal Holloway, and since 2009. Her work is on, it was on contemporary French fiction around crisis, but more recently, representations of consumption, and what Ruth is going to be talking about today will fit into this research area of hers, and specifically biomedical constructions of eating disorders. So Ruth's paper today is entitled Enduring Post-War Eating Disorder, Rereading Elsa Triolet's Food Insecurity and the Psychopathologies of the 30 Glorieuses.
Thanks, Max. Is this okay? Do I need? Yeah, I don't need to. Oh, you want me to? Oh.
so pretentious. Thank you very much. I am, of course, going to express my thanks for Margaret, but I'd also like to start by thanking so much Di and Max amidst their own profound loss for so generously marking Margaret's life and work and organising this celebration today with such grace, love and care. I'm going to try and keep my emotions under control here. So I always wanted to be Margaret Atack when I grew up as an academic. But I didn't imagine growing up without her, and I wouldn't be here without her. And her loss is inestimable. But I am, and French Studies is fortunate that there are so many other amazing role models here, many of them in this room. Whenever I've had the chance, I've always sought to pay Margaret's supportive generosity forward, and that's another legacy that I shall determinedly continue. In our final year at Leeds, Claire and I, and the year before, Anne Hartlett, who's sitting over there next to Paul Bradley, who was Margaret's personal tutee, took Margaret's The Occupation in French Literature module, which, as you can see, not only has half of the core text by women, from Beauvoir to popular fiction, Desforges' rather racy La Bicyclette Bleue, and Sagan's latest, and taking in resistance poetry. Et si c'était à refaire, je referais ce chemin. It was such an inspiring course, which I now realise is all the more inspiring since Margaret was actively sharing her current research with us. And as Hilary has so eloquently established, courageous and groundbreaking in so many ways. Like Claire, it changed my life, this course, though it took me 10 years longer to follow in Margaret's footsteps. And of course, she was right there to help me get into postgraduate work and throughout my career. As well as sparking an interest in the literature of and figuring the occupation and its leftovers, Margaret introduced me to Elisabeth Riolet's 1959 novel, Rose et Crédit, and to the ambivalence of the Trente Glorieuses, all of which, with her questioning frames for thinking about literature and culture, are the springboards for this paper. Margaret's 1989 book, which has much been talked about today, French Resistance, Cultural Politics and Narrative Forms, 1940 to 1950, like her classes, rejects simplistic notions of literature as somehow being transparent, instead mobilising an interpretation of resistance novels as dynamic readings of the social, extending beyond the war and revealing and examining paradoxes. This, and with Chris Lloyd, with Frame, Margaret's attention to the ethical potential of reading literature in the mode of questioning the framing of narratives, has informed my work on leftovers, unthought of ideological, historical and psychological meanings and representations of food and drink, and my current work on biomedical constructions of eating disorders in literature as we know it, and also in the frankly terrifying scientific literature. Meanwhile, Margaret's seminars sparked an interest in me in how, with the black and grey markets, the changing of power relations between rural and urban dwellers, German repositioning, le temps des épiciers, the radical starvation of the Holocaust, the specific challenges for women, rationing until 1950, food and its scarcity must have been the sources of enduring psychological impact during the occupation and into the Trente Glorieuses. So today, taking my lead from Margaret's challenging of dominant narratives about nation, the occupation and France's post-war experiences, and from her empathetic attention to the human, this paper takes food scarcity and insecurity and their potential psychological effects as the premise for rereading case studies of Elisabeth Riolet's occupation and post-war fiction, and for questioning dominant narratives that have come to frame understandings of the occupation and the so-called Trente Glorieuses. As well as considering how little interest and psychological impact there may be in historical accounts of food scarcity and food insecurity during the period, and showing how, perhaps in spite of her ideological aims, Triolet points to psychological effects in her 1943 Les Amants d'Avignon, I'm going to bring into question the physiologically focused scientific literature on an astounding wartime experiment on refeeding after semi-starvation, which has become, right to this day, a framing narrative that limits the understanding of complexities of eating disorders. We'll then return to Triolet's 1959 novel, Rose à Crédit, to explore how this may be read as unwittingly showing how impacts of food scarcity and insecurity may interact with other traumas of the occupation and of the Trente Glorieuses, so that in some individuals with other risk factors and comorbidities, disordered eating develops. A psychopathology which in turn, for folks with risk factors and comorbidities at least, can supplement understanding of and shed light on the experiences of the occupation and of the Trente Glorieuses, and indeed may shed light on understandings of eating disorders. So now, after ATAC, on to some of the narratives which have come to frame understandings of the impact of the occupation. Margaret and Chris Lloyd's work with Frame, Claire Gorrara's On the Roman Noir, Max Silverman's palimpsests of the Holocaust and wars of decolonisation, entre autres, have mobilised fiction in questioning Henri Rousseau's framing narrative of the Syndrome de Vichy, which explains the legacy of the occupation in the Trente Glorieuses as a paradigmatic, time-bound development of psychopathologies. As you'll see later, Rose à Crédit does not play ball with Rousseau, but from Rousseau's Lexis and his contested paradigm, I see residual power in drawing attention to the language of oppression and compulsion and enduring undigested trauma, the passé qui ne passe pas. Another powerful framing narrative is, of course, Jean Forestier's Les Trente Glorieuses, ou La Révolution Invisible. To evaluate the extent of the mutation between 1945 and 1975, Forestier sets up an ostensible comparison between two villages, Madère and Sissek, which he then reveals to be the same village, RHUL in the Lot, 30 years apart. The expression Les Trente Glorieuses has fallen into uncritical popular use to denote unremittingly golden years, and is really ripe for questioning. Forestier's narrative is in fact far more nuanced, exemplifying negative effects of la mutation de la France entière. The emphasis remains on comparing how, across 30 years, the villages are non seulement économiquement différents, mais encore socialement, culturellement, et même, non pas biologiquement, mais physiologiquement. Yet although the food in 1945 sounds like an occupation diet, over half the calories from la soupe de pain et de légumes à la graisse de porc, and in 1975 children are eating too much bread and putting on weight, Forestier does not show much psychological concern. Yet some have been marked by these changes. 10 years later, another powerful framing narrative about the psychological effects of challenging, changing times, Kristen Ross's Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, which was positively reviewed by Margaret and several other people in this room. Ross, you'll remember, adopts the metaphor of hunger insistently, nuancing framings of France's ravenous appetite for modernisation and consumption with the psychopathology of hunger for a cleansing of colonial and post-colonial guilt. However, the psychosomatic effects of hunger, of the occupation, and of post-war rationing is not foregrounded. Whilst historians explore the ambivalence of the occupation in terms of German and Vichy weaponisation of food, and I'm feeling really shifty here with so many excellent historians in the room, and I'm really not one. Vichy weaponisation of food, grey black market profiting, differential food provisioning challenges, their emphasis tends to be physiological. The psychological effects of food scarcity and insecurity is often passed over, despite the just over 1,100 calories of rationed food, according to Mouret, and the ongoing rationing Grenard reminds us of up until 1950. So for psychological effects here, we must go to a historian of bread, Stephen Kaplan, to hear about la psychose de la pénurie. Yet food and lack of it is an overriding concern in occupied France, intersecting with other traumas, other risk factors, other comorbidities, is a likely source of enduring psychological damage for some. My contention then is that we can identify disordered relationships with food emerging in the literature of the occupation, and more insistently in narratives from the so-called Trente Glorieuses. So we can now, using Elsa Triolet as a case study, start to look at representations of the kind of effects we may expect to see, first in literature written in the occupation, and then in post-war writing returning to the occupation, dealing with post-war modernisation and consumer culture. So after taking a sounding with Triolet's 1943 Les Amants d'Avignon, we'll then take a quick trip to wartime Minnesota and a quick but deep dive into scientific literature on starvation as it pertains to eating disorders, before coming back to Triolet's Rose à Crédit. Triolet, a Russian émigré, communist and active resistant, now regrettably most frequently framed as the wife of Louis Aragon, wrote Les Amants d'Avignon, inspired by her own resistance activities in Lyon, and published it clandestinely under the pseudonym Laurent Daniel with Minuit in 1943, and then properly with De Noël in 1944 as part of the Goncourt-winning collection Le Premier Accro de 200 francs, which we studied with Margaret. As well as noting some internalised misogyny in Les Amants d'Avignon, Di Holmes comments that the Triolet's occupation stories remain firmly grounded in the everyday reality of shortages and food queues. And Les Amants d'Avignon certainly brings to life so much of what historians like Mouret and Grenat say about food insecurity and meagre diets during the occupation. Les Amants d'Avignon is the story of a cover girl pretty, ordinary typist Juliette who risks her life on resistance missions, on trains, trafficking in cap d'alimentation, meeting titular fantasy amant resistance kingpin Célestin in Avignon and Lyon, unfed, walking vast distances between often rat-infested rural farmhouses, taking refuge in cafes with nothing but ersatz lemonade to sell, hiding documents and money under a rabbit a good resistant farmer has given her to take back to the city, where her aunt and adopted son won't be able to share their hard-won Christmas meal with her, as her mission sees her sharing stockpiled sardines with Célestin. All of this in exemplary fashion. Juliette is a shining example of ordinary heroism, which is represented as taking its toll. Juliette's aunt, colleague, boss, and the resistance leader, the Dr. Rouquin, who is a gynecologist, comments that she's pale and has bags under her eyes. Juliette's response, "Je ne suis pas malade, je me ronge." What is eating into Juliette then, I'd argue, perhaps against Triolet's ideological intentions, may also be the psychological effects of the trauma of the occupation, stress and resistance activity, as they intersect with the psychological impact of wartime food scarcity and food insecurity. As well as physiologically then, also psychologically, not eating might eat into future psychopathologies. So now, to another profoundly impactful, astonishingly little questioned framing narrative, this time a scientific one, straight out of Minnesota. The year Les Amants d'Avignon was formally published, American psychologist Dr. Ansel Keys and his team began what became known as the classic Minnesota starvation experiment. I imagine other starvation experiments are available, but this is the classic. Why is a paper about Triolet going to Minnesota? Well as the hands and bowls of French children, which feature on this recruitment leaflet, and despite Keys and subsequent eating disorder scientists' own framing narratives, the Minnesota starvation experiment is of great relevance to this discussion. The avowed purpose of the experiment was, given the context of starving wartime Europe, to research the effective methods of refeeding European populations. The protocol involved 36 subjects selected from 200, sorry, this is quite triggering material, 36 subjects selected from 200 plus civilian public service conscientious objectors who were white, male, single, and demonstrated good physical and mental health, an ability to get on with others under trying circumstances, and an interest in relief work. The men spent 3 months on a normal diet of 3,200 calories a day, then considered a maintenance diet, less eating, more physical activity. And let's just pause to remember here that the average daily ration in occupied France, 1941 to 44, was 1,180 calories, and that rationing went on until 1950. Back to Minnesota. After the 3 months, the Minnesota subjects, and I always want to call them victims, and you'll find out why in a minute, were then put on a 6-month semi-starvation ration of 1,570 calories a day, plus exercise, supposedly mirroring European wartime food conditions. The aim, facilitated by individual calorie reductions when deemed necessary, was to achieve 25% body weight reduction. Then came a 3 months restricted rehabilitation period where different refeeding diets of 2,000 to 3,200 calories a day were trialled. Imagine you've had the extreme psychological effects of 6 months starvation and you're still down a third of the calories that you need. An 8-week period of eating ad libitum followed when binging and weight overshooting was recorded. The 2 volumes published in 1950, paradoxically too late to affect refeeding in Europe, although the images here are from a prurient 1945 Life magazine and feature, are astoundingly physiologically focused. Only one chapter, tellingly in the 2nd volume, records psychological effects. Throughout, the claim is that the Minnesota starvation experiment subjects had no long-standing effects, either physiological or psychological. But allegedly short-lived psychological effects of fatigue, irritability, depression, and apathy and food obsession were recorded. Follow-up was extremely scanty, 8 weeks. So psychological effects may, in fact, in some, have persisted. So far, so much conjecture. But the claim of no long-standing effects does not allow for the fact that the published results only featured 32 participants of the 36. 4, that's 11%, were expelled for failure, cheating, and violations. These included excessive gum chewing, not meeting weight loss goals, binging, stealing food, including Swedes, they must have been hungry, from trash, and needing to be admitted to psychiatric wards in 2 cases. These severe cases of disordered eating remain ignored. The Minnesota starvation experiment would clearly contravene the 1949 Geneva Convention, but it's still talked about as a classic. It's something of a go-to citation in eating disorder literature, in care for protocols of refeeding in anorexia, in discussing obesity overshooting, and weight gain. And I've just given you a couple of recent examples here. And look what, in 2018, colleagues from the University of Minnesota say about their own follow-up to the Minnesota starvation experiment. And this couldn't include dead participants, or there were some, and they failed to track down all the living participants. Impressively, Eckert et al. Acknowledged the devastating effects of the experiment on the 4 participants expelled from it, although they do echo the terminology of violations and failure. They do admit that there is a link between prolonged starvation and binge eating, but this link is not the case for everyone. But they're claiming, particularly unscientific terms, that personality and temperament is at play, as though somehow in 2018, referencing differential psychological impact was somehow disrespectful for the unethical experiment, and that in 2018, individuals with risk factors and comorbidities subjected to semi-starvation are somehow to blame. The enduring credibility given to this experiment is astounding. It was published too late for post-war refeeding. Just 5 years later, it would not have been allowed by the Geneva Convention. The sample of white, male, single, pre-screened, conscientious objectors is deeply unrepresentative, and it's likely that those subjects were deeply invested in asserting the value of their deprivation. The resulting volumes selectively and unremittingly emphasise the physiological and demonstrate willing blindness to, and indeed demonising of, psychological distress, evidenced by the literal throwing out of the participants who developed compulsive binging behaviours, disordered eating and psychosis. This is even more astounding given that, as the mention of the Holocaust survivors in Eckert et al.'s problematic follow-up to the experiment suggests there is evidence of the prolonged psychological effects of wartime starvation, of PTSD as a risk factor for eating disorders and binge eating, of the links between eating disorders, binge eating, and food insecurity. Here, it's worth pausing to underscore that still today, it remains unknown what causes eating disorders, and that we still don't know how to successfully treat them. That eating disorders are the second most fatal of psychiatric illnesses, that recovery and remission rates are only estimated at 60%. Yet amidst shame, stigma, and wildly inaccurate stereotypes of thin, white, cis, het, high-achieving, middle-class girls, which include the fact that eating disorders occur right across genders, sexualities, communities, body shapes, ethnicities, and ages, underdiagnosis, underfunding, and lack of research compound this lack of knowledge, whilst dominant and arguably dangerous framing narratives prevail. Yet, if you look for it, there is research on the intersectional risk factors and comorbidities in eating disorders. It's usefully enumerated here in Margaret et al.'s 2023 rapid review, where we see food insecurity, stressful life events, trauma, family disruption, neglect, abuse, PTSD, and ASD. So let's mobilise our questioning of the powerful framing narrative of the Minnesota starvation experiment, which, unquestioned, has had hugely detrimental impacts on the field of eating disorders, to come back to France, where we can question the lack of attention to how trauma, radical food scarcity, and insecurity may have had psychological ramifications for some individuals during the 30 Glorieuses. We'd be relieved to get back to Hilary. As well as Margaret drawing my attention to RHUL Crédit, Hilary herself pairs the novel with Les Amants d'Avignon, in the forward to a new edition of Le Premier Cru in 1965. She draws attention to how, despite their cover girl looks, her doughty Juliet is deterministically different from Martine, the protagonist of RHUL Crédit. Triolet's forward to the novel also paints a grim picture of historical determinism of being subsumed into consumer culture. However, I'm going to reread the novel by drawing on some of my thinking coming out of my questioning of framing narratives, to consider how the effects of food insecurity and scarcity, as they intersect with risk factors and comorbidities, may, in some, result in symptoms of disordered eating. So, born in a rat-infested rural shack, the oldest of a single-parent, multiply-fathered famille nombreuse, living through the occupation, the arrival of the Germans, and a constantly changing cast of her single mother's lovers, beautiful, shapely, perfectionist, aloof, obsessive, dirt-hating Martine is scooped up by her friend Cécile's mother and fueled by obsessive love for resistance hero Danielle, whom she marries. Martine seems to escape her multiply traumatic, food-insecure childhood during and after the occupation to a new married life in Paris. Here, she becomes hopelessly embroiled with consumer credit and beauty ideals, and this leads to divorce, disordered eating, and untimely death, consumed by the rats that infested the hovel of her childhood. Most critics of RHUL Crédit frame the novel as a cautionary tale of consumerism as it takes off in post-war France. A few attend to the potentially underlying psychopathologies: Ross's hunger for purity, Célier's generic madness, Walker, albeit in a footnote, getting closer to food and horror through abjection. But the story that has not been told is that of trauma, including of the occupation and its legacy, as it intersects with food insecurity and long-term starvation. This supplements what we can identify as the kind of pathological effects of the occupation of French people, which Margaret demonstrated, questioning Rousseau's paradigm of the miroir brisé. It supplements representations supporting Ross's idea. I'll carry on. It supplements, where am I supplementing things? Yes. It supplements representation supporting Ross's idea of modernisation as experienced as trauma, as a shock of the new, and the difficulties Forestier sees in the mutation of the 30 Glorieuses. In RHUL Crédit, the effects of food security during the occupation food scarcity during the occupation. But we also see how these intersect with other comorbidities and risk factors for developing eating disorders, some of which may indeed have been shared by the 11% of Minnesota victims who developed binge eating and psychosis, as well as those who may not have disclosed ongoing effects. A story then, not just a consumer culture, but a case study of how its impact and trauma and the semi-starvation of the occupation may interact in certain folks with individual vulnerabilities and be expressed in disordered eating. The novel begins with a traumatic scene which underscores, sorry, it's this one, isn't it? Oops. Yes, this one. So the novel begins with a traumatic scene which underscores poverty, occupation, food scarcity and food insecurity, as Martine faints into her frankly disgusting yet food insecurity, economically hard-won place of porte au feu comme il faut. In terms of stressful life events and childhood adversity, significant family disruption, childhood trauma, including neglect and emotional sexual abuse, well, there is so much. A recap of Martine's childhood trauma closes the novel. Martine, née dégoûtée, couchant sur de la paille pourrie, avec des rats qui couraient sur des corps des dormeurs, des corps jamais lavés. Martine qui resta dehors en attendant que sa mère en ait fini avec un homme ou un autre. And there's also a reference to potential racism, to fear of being raped by Germans, to the repression of both Martine's and her imprisoned resistant husband Daniel's repressed trauma. There's a traumatic miscarriage, a traumatic divorce, loss of job, revenue, home, and ultimately life. Simultaneously, as for potential psychological factors, including diagnoses of PTSD, ADHD, or ASD, representations of Martine further suggest neurodiversity and autistic traits. And simultaneously, perfectionist Martine is represented with attributes we might now link with OCD. Martine is consistently subjected to the internalisation of the thin ideal, not in the least by Trier's own internalised misogyny. From being a sketchy eater, Martine develops binge-eating behaviours, and her distress is so poignantly underscored as she returns by bus, penniless, passing the auberge where she celebrated her wedding to Danielle, to the now modernised village of her childhood, self-medicatingly binging on sweets. Such an image of distress. But you might say, how come, after all of this, Martine doesn't really sound as though she has an eating disorder, look as though she has an eating disorder? Well, that's what the eating disorders framing narratives would say. In eating disorders literature, the emphasis on physiology, on starvation, on anorexia and bulimia occludes attention to other eating disorders. The golden girl stereotypes I mentioned before occlude how eating disorders occur right across the population. The effects of starvation can be present in individuals of any size and may be part of a shifting psychopathology that does not simply fit the frame. And there is more appreciation nowadays of the far-reaching effects of starvation on the body and the brain. Additionally, there is recognition that the effects of starvation can be present in individuals at any size. In diagnostic terms, Martine's behaviours would probably qualify as objective binging, and as of 2013, the diagnosis of OSFED. You probably haven't heard of OSFED. Well, once again, the power of framing narratives and the urgent need to question them. Little known OSFED is the most frequently diagnosed eating disorder, an estimated 47% of diagnoses against 8% for anorexia. So again, the power of framing narratives, stereotypes, and the prurient lure of emaciated bodies that we saw in the magazine photos. OSFED is just a series of better-known eating disorders, and the primary diagnostic criteria of OSFED is distress and impairment to function. You can see it here from DSM-5. The overlooked psychological effects of eating disorders discourses are drowned out by framing narratives which focus physiologically on body mass and eating behaviours. Such distress and impairment we can see in representations of Martine, which in turn may also speak to other experiences in the Trente Glorieuses, maybe 11%, like the Minnesota starvation experiment, or in a less coercively framed understanding, maybe yet more. If we look at intersections of trauma, starvation, risk factors and comorbidities, attending to the potential and interrogating the not knowing, exploring uncertainty and plurality that underlies scientific literature. If we look for and interpret literature as we understand it, we may find more. If we look at the narratives coming out of post-war France, following in Margaret's footsteps, attending to the physiological and the psychological effects that don't neatly fit into paradigms, if we question framing narratives critically and with affect and empathy, we might reread disordered eating expressed, say, in Beauvoir's Les Belles Images, Le nez, la dentelière, Paraître les choses, Jaurès is de l'ortho comptabile, et j'en passe. Which brings us back to Margaret and her mobilising of the power of literature and her mobilising of empathy in questioning framing narratives. As this paper is the mode of questioning and opening, I won't conclude it. So I'll just come full circle and thank you all for listening, and as ever, to thank Margaret.
Thank you, Ruth. We'll move on to next speaker, final speaker, and then we'll take some questions afterwards as we've been doing all along. This is Dave Platten, who introduced himself before, and I'll introduce him again briefly. Dave has been a colleague at Leeds since 1989, in fact the year that Ruth and Claire left. Dave's been a specialist. He wrote, first of all, about Michel Tournier. He's written about crime fiction. He's written on popular culture. He's nothing if not incredibly diverse. He's written about monsters as well. He's writing a book at the moment on Camus' what he's either going to call Tomorrow's World or Killing Time. He hasn't chosen yet. Since his time at Leeds, he's been the head of French, he's been pro-dean for student education, and he's also played a lot of football, some of it with me, but he's actually a better player than me. Anyway, Dave. The title of Dave's talk, by the way, is There is no justice, in quotes, there is no justice, there is just us, end quote, saying and not doing in Camus' La Chute, 1956.
As it says nicely right at the top of the screen there. Okay. Shall I do the interview a bit of that? Okay, that's better, isn't it? So, why Camus, why La Chute? And what's that got to do with Margaret? I'll better explain that first. When you're in the pub, after a game of football, with or without Max, and you're talking to friends who are not part of the university, that work at the university, and everything, every now and then they might be minded to ask you what you do, or what you do for your research. And in 30 odd years, I've always had to explain at great length what I do with my research, because they don't have any knowledge of what I've been studying or anything, and they glaze over. You probably had the same experience. But more recently it's happened. I said, oh, I'm thinking I want to look on a French writer called Camus. Oh really, Camus, I know him. And you begin to get a conversation, and that's a good thing about doing Camus, working on Camus. The bad thing is that you have to read La Chute. And I'd been kind of putting it off. But I bumped into Margaret. I've been reading Camus more seriously for about 3 years. I bumped into Margaret about 4 years ago, 2019, and we had a chat, and she's asking me what I was up to. I said, I'm just thinking about this, got a few ideas about Camus, and doing a few things on Camus. She's very enthusiastic, and she said, what's your favourite Camus novel or play or whatever? And I said, probably the premier rang, you know, the last posthumous one. And she said, oh, mine's La Chute. It's such a wonderful, my favourite novel, one of my favourite novels of all time. So I thought, oh, cool. So I thought, well, I better read this at some point. And I asked Margaret, as my project was developing, whether she'd be comfortable to act as a reader, to read my stuff, as I've done for her, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years of her career. And she said she was delighted, she really wanted to do that. So I thought, well, I'll have to sort of do something on La Chute. And of course, I never had the occasion to discuss La Chute in any informed way with Margaret, so I thought I'd try and rise to the challenge today. The process of producing this paper has been a little painful, as I expected, and I shall now enjoy inflicting some of that pain on you, so you'll enjoy your drinks afterwards. Okay, so the two things that people know about La Chute, or if they've not read it for a long time or never read it, are probably the woman falling from the bridge. That's the suitably gloomy photograph of the Pont Royal in Paris, and secondly, the missing painting. So I wasn't going to really talk about the painting at all, but then I realised Emma Cayley was coming to today's event, and Emma's my boss and in charge of my workload, and so I thought I'd put in something that she would more with her period. So the painting itself, this is the missing painting from this rather desultory, this gloomy, grubby Amsterdam bar, Mexico City, which is missing from the wall. There's a rectangle. Well, it's not all of that, it's just the panel on the bottom left, les juges intègres, the just judges. At the bottom panel, the Ghent altarpiece, painted in 1430, 1432 by the Van Eyck brothers. And of course, when you just look into the basic facts about this painting, you find all sorts of topical things. So it was the les juges intègres panel, as well as the John the Baptist panel, was stolen from the St. Bavoux Cathedral in Ghent on 10th of April 1934. The thief returned the John the Baptist panel as a gesture of goodwill, but les juges intègres was never found, and then all sorts of conspiracies and theories became attached to this story. The entire painting had been sequestered by German forces during World War I and taken to Berlin, and then the Treaty of Versailles stipulated that it be returned to Ghent. The presence of the judges in the Ghent altarpiece, none of whom were canonised saints, is an intriguing anomaly. In La Chute, the painting is absent from the wall of the Mexico City bar in Amsterdam, and it's later claimed that the protagonist Clemence has it in his possession. And of course, in Kennedy's eyes, the righteous judges are, of course, not so righteous, or not righteous at all. They would have no place in a kind of sacred firmament. The Ghent altarpiece was considered a sacred painting, and at one time was only shown on significant days of the Christian calendar. And of course, the whole scenario in itself, the location of the stolen painting in this Amsterdam bar, is absurd. But I'll go back to it maybe later, probably not. So La Chute is pastiche then. So there's a sense there that the painting in itself is emblematic of the character of this novella, as a kind of pastiche, or even in parts as a parody. By the time that it came out, let's hop forward. By the time that it came out, Camus was in a pickle. For most of his adult life, he'd been at the heart of what seemed to matter, firstly in Algeria, then in France, and on the cusp of middle age, he seemed to be losing touch. His voice was no longer heard or listened to, possibly in the way it had been. There was the rupture with the French intellectual left, following the publication in 1952 of L'Homme Révolté. And then, the Camus specialists who in the audience will know this, but on the 22nd of January 1956, he addressed an audience at the Cercle du Progrès, a building on the lower edge of the Casbah in Algiers. Security for the event was apparently provided by armed FLN representatives inside the hall. Outside there was a mob of far-right pieds noirs, settlers, chanting Camus Puto, Mendes Hansel Puto, and to an ethnically mixed gathering inside the hall, including many influential public figures in Algiers, Camus appealed for a civilian truce, not for the cessation of hostilities as such, but for the sparing of civilian blood. Pebbles clattered against the window panes, and he spoke in lyrical tones that tried to evoke common values beyond entrenched ideological divisions. The full text of his speech, Pour une Trêve Civile, was published in Algiers shortly afterwards, though precautions were taken. So sometimes, for example, the name of the printer was smudged out as a protection against possible reprisal. And in any event, Camus' words were not heeded. It was widely suggested that afterwards he was stitched up by the FLN, principally through the person of Amar Ouzigan, who was a former ally in the Parti Communiste Algérien. Because at the time the nationalist movement, the FLN, was already on a war footing and preparing for the terror campaign to come. So a year later, in February 1957, he announced his intention to withdraw from public debate on Algeria. So that was the kind of context. So it's an important context to La Chute, but not the only one. The La Chute began as a short story destined for the L'exil et le Royaume collection, but Camus decided to expand it, acknowledging perhaps that this pastiche, this philosophical dialogue, if you like, between barflies in Amsterdam was an opportunity to provide a creative riposte to people who he probably thought were out to get him, kind of gunslingers, if you like, of an increasingly polemical left bank. And this one-sided discussion, ostensibly about what it means to lead a righteous or just existence, consists of very intricately woven threads, forming a text which is profused by references to many different things, to the Holocaust, extensively to the Bible, to Dante, Nietzsche, Sartre, to his wife, Francine Camus, to his own work, L'Étranger, and much else besides. All animated by this one odd character, Clémence, who's apparently in search of validation. So that's that context. Who is Clémence? Well, the Algerian crisis, I think, is a kind of a gateway to La Chute. He talks about the famous L'estimable Gorrara, the doorman at the Mexico City in the opening pages. He mentioned casually as he came in to give this speech in Algiers, you know, voici mes deux gorilles, his security, which is provided by friends of his brother. It began off as a short story, but then he decided to expand it, and you've got this one that it's often read as a coded, if you like, autobiography. That's a favoured reading of La Chute. And indeed, there are lots of parallels between Clémence and his creator. Okay, so we hear lots of familiar things for Camus readers in La Chute, the familiar reverence for theatre and for football, musings on justice, the aspiration to a kind of secular sainthood, and all this proffered by a man who will, within the text, reveal himself to be a cruel misogynist. And so you very much get the sense of, from La Chute, that Camus, as Clémence, would equal populist, hypocritical moralist, womanizer, neglectful husband, football and theatre. Michel Onfray, a well-known French public intellectual, reads Clémence's protestations and his recriminations as freighted with the anxiety and depression provoked by the attacks on Camus' work by Sartre, by Merleau-Ponty and others, and also exacerbated by the illness of his wife Francine, who in the last days of 1953 may or may not have attempted to take her own life by jumping from a first floor window. In the novel, Clémence is condemned to vivre dans le malconfort. This is described as a medieval cell, the dimensions of which prevent the incarcerated person from either standing up straight or lying prone. He also refers to some other kind of torture, medieval torture, which is called la cellule des crachats, where the prisoner is required to stand almost immobilized in a kind of a open-topped concrete shell, exposed to the spittle of passing jailers. Onfray argues that these dual metaphors kind of expiate two forms of personal suffering endured by Camus in the early to mid-1950s. You've got the quote there, le double tourment d'un Camus confronté à la tentative de suicide de sa femme et au déchaînement de l'intelligentsia parisienne contre lui, douleur privée, douleur publique. So the question then arises as to why Camus would have wanted to kind of air his dirty linen in this way. It doesn't seem usual way for him to write or to be. At stake is the character and voice of the narrator. An interesting comparison can be drawn with the work of Pierre Bayard, who's a French scholar, intellectual, wrote an interesting book called Oh, j'ai été résistant au bourreau, about 2014, I think. And Bayard explores how he might have reacted were he pitched into a variety of scenarios, some real, some fictional, all connected with wartime and occupation, the Holocaust and its aftermath as well. And in order to do this, he gives us a theoretical formulation. He creates a kind of simulation of the self, a kind of knowing simulation of self, a personnage délégué, who wears the shoes of various protagonists. Those of the eponymous hero of Louis Malle's film La Commission, the participant in the famous psychological experiments of Stanley Milgram, which appear to demonstrate that most people would not intervene to prevent the torture, death of other human beings, if they believed that the suffering was officially sanctioned. Of a German officer applying the principle that the individual soldier would not be required to take part in a firing squad against his wish. One of les Justes of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, the mainly Huguenot villagers who sheltered thousands of Jewish children, and even of the novelist Romain Gary, who he kind of described as an accidental hero of the resistance. So Bayard activates this character close but not identical to himself, and then imagining that character as someone else, he kind of goes about in this kind of mental mind game of rekindling each of these stories in the hope of gaining access to some point where he might better understand, if you like, how important life-changing, life-shaping decisions are made. We could think of Clémence in La Chute as Camus' personnage délégué, although of course he's really only interested in his own past life and not in the lives of others. Yet the distance between Camus and Clémence seems much greater than that between Bayard and his alter ego. And this is evident from the way in which Clémence addresses speaking of himself in the third person as a kind of perfect citizen. So you've got these quotes in the early sections of the text. Un homme dans la force de l'âge, de parfaite santé, généreusement doué, habile dans les exercices du corps comme dans ceux de l'intelligence, etc., etc. Okay? Vous admettrez alors que je puisse parler en toute modestie d'une vie réussie. Okay, so this deliberately turgid life story, sort of puffed up with this kind of comic hyperbole, really has very little to do with Camus' writing. Okay, it's very unlike, well, certainly Camus is a character who's often cites the idea of mesure, or proportionality, in the way that he expresses himself and writes. Okay. Clémence, there are, at this point as well, we will notice that a number of paradoxes and contradictions in the text. Clémence is more than happy to take his place in a social hierarchy, sur les cimes, bien au-dessus des formules humaines. But a few pages earlier, he's compared this ageless wisdom of the bartender, cet air de gravité ombrageuse, comme s'il avait le soupçon loin de quelque chose de tourne par rang entre les hommes. And he compares these to what he calls les deux fureurs, the two obsessions of his concitoyens, the sophisticated Parisian elite. Je rêve parfois de ce que diront de nous les historiens futurs. Une phrase ne suffirait pour l'homme moderne. Il forniquait et il lisait des journaux. I like that. I've got a nice photograph of the camera reading newspaper there, which might seem to some people a very perfect acceptable way to live one's life, fornicating and reading newspapers, but there we are. So, so irony and self-deprecation. Sorry, I've jumped ahead of my slide. There he is, more newspapery there. I'm not used to these slides. Okay, so there's a rabbit. I hope to sort of give you a few extra kind of things there. Camus may not be Camus, but differentiating between them by passing the narrative discourse of La Chute, not always straightforward. And I think this is what I really think about this, is that when I was reading La Chute, you always arrive at a moment, you very frequently arrive at a moment that then you're kind of pitching against the flow of the narrative, and you're almost kind of sent backwards all the time. And you end up going down these kind of rabbit holes, or intertextual rabbit holes. There's a really good example. You get not very far into the text, you've got past the first little section, and you read the statement. En vérité, à force d'être homme avec tant de plénitude, simplicité, je vous trouvais un peu surhomme. So, obviously a superficial, very pretentious reference to Nietzsche, actually the Superman. And then you think, well, hold on a minute, what's all that stuff about the gorillas and apes and early man, earlier in the text? So you tend to, you're kind of going backwards again, okay? And you recall Clarence's admiration for l'estimable Gorrara, and then you track back 10 pages further on, and you imagine l'homme de Cro-Magnon pensionnaire à la tour de Babel, il y souffrait de dépaysement au moins, etc., etc. And the reader with perhaps a little bit more knowledge of philosophy or Nietzsche will reflect on another Nietzsche aphorism from the prologue to the Spoke Zarathustra. Once you are apes, famous, once you are apes, and even yet man is more of an ape than any of the apes, which is normally read as a rejection of Western metaphysics, and especially the bogus set of moral values which for Nietzsche contaminates all the post-Hellenic philosophical systems. We are not who we think we are, as the disappointed man declares in the Twilight of the Idols. I sought great human beings, I've never found anything but the apes of their idea. On the other hand, the estimable gorilla in La Chute may have more in common with the ape in Kafka's short story, Report to an Academy. Kafka, another favoured writer of Camus, who, having evolved to the intelligence of the average European man, presents a report which takes the form of an autobiography. So this is just one rabbit hole among many, many rabbit holes in La Chute. Before you encounter the most recognisable reference to the surhomme, Nietzsche has already gone viral in the text. And a close reading of La Chute reveals this dense, hypertextual network that often extends way beyond the parameters of text. You might say that's what happens when we read anything that we read, but it's particularly noted in La Chute. And I find that the experience of reading it can sometimes be like crawling through barbed wire, you're just constantly getting snapped. However, help is at hand. Jump schneid thing there, from neuroscience. So I'm just going to, my overall argument here is that La Chute can actually help us discover more about how the brain works, and that's what I want to just focus on. Neuroscientist Michael Gessinger, did you all know that you all have what a neuroscientist called a left brain interpreter? This is derived from, did anybody know about the split brain experiment? So I'd never read about this. When I read about it, I was astonished really. Okay, the left brain interpreter, Michael Gazzaniga, neuroscientist, says that as plants and we as humans are endowed with a left brain interpreter. This is what we all use, left side hemisphere of the brain, to seek explanation for events, triage the barrage of incoming information and construct narratives that help to make sense of the world. After a career spent devising tests for split brain patients, split brain patients were people who were operated on in the 1970s, and what they did was that they chopped their head in half down the vertical axis down here. Okay, so they cut the head open and they cut the cortexes, or the what would you call them? The corpus callosum. It's called the bundle of fibres, neuronal fibres connecting the two halves of the brain, and then they sewed them back up again. And they did this because they were trying to cure them with acute epilepsy. So the risks involved with the operation outweighed the cure was such that their epilepsy was so bad that they would probably die of it. Their epilepsy was cured, but afterwards they experienced strange after effects. You may not be surprised, because the connection between the right side of the brain, which processes visual data, and the left, which controls speech and language, had been severed. So you could show a split brain of someone who recovered an image of an apple, and they wouldn't be able to say what it was. But in the next few seconds, they would pick out an apple from a range of other fruit on the table. Okay? More sophisticated experiments show that quite soon, one of these subjects were able to reconcile these distinctions. So you had a split brain patient who, in the initial months after the operation, struggled to go shopping in the supermarket, but then a year post-surgery was able to tie shoelaces, play cards, and go water skiing. Okay? This function, identified by Michael Gazzaniga, explains why we are, like Clemence, editors of our lives. And in the digital era, of course, we edit ourselves more conspicuously, don't we? We construct profiles on social media, on dating apps, we, of course, going for jobs, submitting applications for promotion. The problem I find with La Chute is from the very beginning, this editor function is in overdrive. So if we zoom in on those first pages, we see that it's a text which is saturated in what linguists call antiphrasis. Okay? It's a narrative which exists in predictive mode, like the machines on which we depend that love to correct what we type into them. So you've got, sorry, I'm losing a bit my pages. So what we get in La Chute, then we get this text is saturated in antiphrasis narrative. And we go back to this character of the barman, the gorilla, the estimable gorilla, and you've got these kind of comments. Il se hâte avec une sage lenteur, son mutisme est assourdissant, c'est le silence des forêts primitives, chargé jusqu'à la gueule. Another example, a delicious example from this very early on again at the same time. Quand on a beaucoup médité sur l'homme, par métier ou par vocation, il arrive qu'on éprouve la nostalgie pour les primates. So lots of thinking, nostalgie for primates. Ils n'ont pas eux d'arrière-pensée. So there's this notion, this idea that we compulsively edit our lives, but we can't edit the past. Colin Davis, in his book Traces of War, I've lost my sheets now, I'm just going to sort of improvise. Colin Davis, in Traces of War, writes about the notion of the Holocaust as a kind of master trope. In La Chute, he picks up, therefore, on an early reference that you've got there. Moi, j'habite le quartier juif, ce qui s'appelait ainsi jusqu'au moment où les règnes ont fait de la place. Quel lessivage, 75 000 juifs déportés, assassinés sur les toits nettoyage par le vide. So this notion of the Holocaust, of the Nazi hecatomb as a master trope in La Chute, Colin Davis analyses the novel a little bit in the slipstream of Shoshana Feldman's analysis of the way that the references are intertwined, and particularly reference to what they call the primal scene on the bridge. He he and Feldman both refer to this as the primal scene when the woman falls from the bridge over the River Seine. There's an impressionistic sparseness of the reportage, the cold, the darkness, the splash, the cries, the anonymity of the victim, and the guilt of Clémence. They are all evocative, but not necessarily as convincing for Colin Davis as for Shoshana Feldman. There's a sense that Davis feels that Feldman is guilty of a kind of overreach, finding reference to endorse the reading which are not entirely there in the text. He finds that the ethics are messy. Okay? I think that both are wise to the political undercurrent swirling around La Chute, with Davis nervous about Feldman's fulsomeness and praise of Camus' condemnation of the Gulag, but neither is, I think, fully in step with the rhythm of the text. For the story of the woman falling from the bridge is, as all readers and teachers of the novel know, the pivotal event. The moment when, as Camus famously remarks in the Pierre d'Inséré, printed in the Pléiade edition after the story, Clémence holds his mirror up to us. He walks on, the water would have been so cold, he says, but what would you have done? And there is no respite in the past, as Kierkegaard in famous axiom surmises, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Colin is worried about the assumptions that we might make, or readers might make, about the woman falling. Was she pushed? Did she fall? Was the noise of a splash made by something or somebody else? But at this juncture in the novel, all this congested narrative, congested words, these massive paradoxical, antithetical, antiphrastic words, they melt away, okay? The narrative is plain smooth, the style limpid and economical. We're back with Merceau on the beach. And as the narrator says, pour que la statue soit nue, le beau discours doit s'envoler. The swarm of antithetical word thoughts fly away. This is the moment for action. Now, the fall from the bridge is foreshadowed several times in the text, but the one previous existential incident concerns a story Clémence has heard about an old woman in a village forced by a German officer to designate which of her two sons would be shot as a hostage. It is, of course, an unimaginable, impossible choice presented as a kind of dialectical clinch, stripped of nuance. Does a similar binarism present itself on that damp Parisian night on the quayside? Well, of course it doesn't. Were Clémence to turn around, there'd be a whole raft of different options would have presented themselves, short of him diving into the river. He might have shouted for help, thrown a floatable object towards the woman in the water, waded in as far as he could before holding out a stick, all sorts of things, called for help. And this is because I don't read the fall from the bridge as a primal scene. Instead, it's closer to the kind of incident that punctuates everyday life. Do you call out the racist football supporter, the sexist boss at the workplace, the person who drops litter? And what might dictate our behaviour in such circumstances? Well, I'm going to neuroscience again. Prairie voles. They're very cuddly. Look, there's a picture there with little hearts around them. Okay, this is where my quote comes from. Prairie voles are very sociable creatures. Well, they're not all. You can get one genus of prairie vole living in the same prairie as another one, another genus. One set are incredibly sociable, okay? The others are incredibly, I don't know if the word misanthropic can apply to prairie voles, but anyway, they don't like other prairie voles at all, and they plough their own furrows as much as they possibly can. And scientists did some research on this, and they found it's because the very, very sociable prairie voles have very, very close, dense clustering of oxytocin receptors in their brain. So when their body releases oxytocin, okay, the receptors are very close and very dense, and there are a lot of them. Whereas the prairie voles that are like Clemence, so a bit of a sociopath and just walk on, have got just one or two scattered here or there, but not very many around. This was within a paper by evolutionary biologist Patricia Smith-Churchland. So she would say that our actions in the situation on the bridge in La Chute are dictated by the clustering of oxytocin receptors in those parts of the brain that are conducive to the pleasurable aspects of sociality. Getting on with people, helping others should make us happy, and this would happen in the absence of any religious authority. We're programmed, she argues, to live and work together, but she recognises the limitations of neuroscience. She says it cannot tell us, for example, whether it's appropriate to use drones to kill terrorists, or indeed leaders of groups, or to interfere with the human genome. In resolving such matters, she says, we are as diverse groups of humans, and we are on our own. And there you've got the quote where says, there is no justice, there is just us, which I think she stole from Terry Pratchett. So just to sort of cement that, I just want to quick word on the kind of immutability of stone. There's a section in the book where Clemence talks of wanted to leave the Zuidzee, this kind of rather inert airy water in the Netherlands, avec ses bords plats, perdus dans la brume. C'est où elle commence, où elle finit, and he contrasts it with the stark visibility of the Aegean. Okay, you've got the quote there. This is classic Camus. He's contrasting the kind of fuzziness and cloudiness of European philosophy with the stark, sharp contours of ancient Greek thought. But it's also part of his predilection for stone generally. The desert he sees always seems to be a kind of, since the meeting to see if he talks about the desert as a kind of a place where he thinks about metaphysics or about philosophy. There's Sisyphe, of course, there's the stele dedicated to Camus Tipaza, which is still there despite having been vandalised and graffiti. And in a sense, these kind of this stony ethics that he has actually kind of defines Camus. He's a warrior against poverty, against nationalism, racism, social injustice, totalitarianism, terrorism, and capital punishment. All of those things, as all Camus readers know, inform both his fiction and his journalism and his activism. So, I'm coming to Margaret now. This is just, I'm nearing the end, but I've got a few things to say, and I've managed to find a different photograph of Margaret from the one that was on there. So, it wasn't just I want to talk about La Chute because of Margaret, chance meeting in the corridor a few years ago. It's something about Margaret. We talked this morning about the importance and love of words. Margaret, I think, liked La Chute because she would go down one of those rabbit holes much more quickly and successfully than I do, up, out, and then down another one. And I think she really enjoyed texts that were like that were dense and referential in that way. But Margaret lived the very fullest of lives. She was much more than just words, and I'm plugging on just there a little. And this was brought home to me at the wake, at her funeral. There was a display of photographs that some of you who were there may have had a chance to peruse. Family had put together of Margaret. And there was a photograph that I was immediately kind of caught my eye, magnetized to, and it was Margaret probably in the early 90s, looking young and beautiful and confident, and then she was They were having a picnic. The photographs are probably taken by David. They're having a picnic, and Margaret was sitting on the mat, and one of the children, I think it was the youngest, was coming around from there. But she immediately captured, it's like what did that call it, the punctum, you know, your gaze was straight on Margaret. And I was thinking about it, and I thought that Margaret and Dave adopted 3 small children who had very, very traumatic early infancy. I think the youngest was only a baby when they adopted her. Altogether, 3 siblings. And you know that Margaret and David, because they were the most thorough of researchers, would have researched the whole situation, what the situation would be like in the future, adopting children who carried with them trauma of early years of abuse. And that was in her face there, looking confidently towards the future. There were the kids there, and you just had the feeling that, you know, they'd sorted out, they were going to go for it, because it was part of the totality of Margaret's life. She went on to be not only a fantastic researcher, a great teacher and role model, really helpful to younger, well, I suppose, well, I would have been an early career academic at the time. Very encouraging, would never fob you off, say everything's good if it wasn't, and she'd let you know if it wasn't very good. There was no nonsense like that. She went on, and we haven't been talking about it, she was Pro-Vice Chancellor for research at Leeds University for a decade, 10 years now maybe, I meant 10 years or so. Right at the time when the kids were in arrears, a significant amount of turbulence during their teenage years. She kept it going, she kept her research going, she won a big grant while she was PVC for research, and anybody who's done a job like that will know that most of your life, and most of the year is timetabled with meetings, you know, you really have very little time to yourself. And then about 2000, only 10 years ago, she stopped being PVC, and she came back to teach in the French department. At the age of 65, fairly unusual, I'm discovering, and she immediately came and set up 2 final year modules, one the famous celebrated on occupation, and literary occupation, and the other on existentialisms. And within 2 years, I think, she won something called the Partnership Award. Now, that may not mean anything to you, but Partnership Awards are the awards given at our university, it's a big university, for excellence in teaching. Okay, they are like hen's teeth to actually win an overall award. And I suspect that in some of the faculties outside of ours, there are people that kind of train their students to set nominations and get credit. Margaret just won it and it was particularly the students that nominated her for her existentialism module on which she taught that sheet. I'm still in contact with one of those students who I taught as well, a guy called Rowan Hargreaves, champion snowboarder, also very assiduous student. Rowan works in British Columbia now, and he works as a kind of in the local authority to promote culture of indigenous peoples and in a constructive sort of way. And after Margaret had died, I remembered that Rowan had known her and talked to her, and eventually, a few months later, I emailed him and told him the sad news. And he, in the email that came back, this couple of days, it was clear, through even a fairly soulless kind of way of communication, that email, over 4,000 or 5,000 miles away, he was really, really shaken by the news. And he wrote back and he said that, so basically he'd only ever known Margaret for 2 hours a week for 10 weeks of his life. But he said it had absolutely shaped his future. He would never have been able to go on to do what he'd done in his life without that 10 weeks, and that's how he felt. Not only that, without me knowing, I told him that I was going to appear at this event. And I said I'd like to mention, named Rowan Hargreaves, I'd like to mention Rowan event. Was that okay? He said, yeah. And then a month or two later, he sent me some material, and he said, I've got in contact with some sort of like obscure office in the University of Leeds, and they've given me all 5, they had copies of all 5 of the nominations written by students for Margaret's teaching. And so they're my last 2 slides. I don't know whether you can see them all there, but I think we're all interested in Margaret's research, and that's why we're here. But this will actually tell you that she was as brilliant a teacher, as we've heard from Ruth and from Claire, as she was a researcher. Dr. Atack, this is a woman who's done it all by here. There's nothing to prove anything. Has been an incredible teacher, passionate about what she does, and created such a great atmosphere in the seminars. As I love for the subjects and changes, we're all indebted to her and to her intellect. Daddy, look at this one. I was lucky to talk about Margaret for the first time as I took the module, although I'd never studied philosophy before. I can honestly say it was the most interesting role model I've taken to date. Margaret's passion and enthusiasm for the subject were clear at every class, and her encouragement to explore complex ideas and guidance messages is invaluable. And so these were submitted independently and spontaneously by these students. And there you've got more module leader, and not unexpectedly, maybe when you read all those things, she won the award, and was, I think, by all accounts, a usually modest self when she took it. So there we go, Margaret Atack, the best of us. Thank you very much.